Welcome to Ghostly Tales channel. Are you looking for creepy, mysterious, and dramatic stories? You have come to the right place. Here, we will bring you unforgettable experiences with ghost stories, terrifying urban legends and mysteries that you have never dared to explore. Come with us into the world of mysteries, where every sound can make your heart beat faster. Please listen, everyone. Curse on the haunted land. Early winter mornings in Thuong village are still very gloomy. Thick fog obscures all vision. People have to walk very close to each other to be able to see each other. The wind rustles through the banana leaves, mixed with the cold air, making people feel creepy, cold to the point of goosebumps. The wind blows through the old bamboo doors of the stalls that the locals here have temporarily set up to sell goods in the early mornings. The creaking sound makes the space even colder and gloomy. At that time on the village road there are two figures walking very hurriedly. A woman's voice breaks the cold silence. This seems to be the beginning of our village, right? The fog is so thick that I can't see anything. I just remember going through the market at the beginning of our village. Turning right at this banana grove is the entrance to our house. The person walking next to him replied. It was a man's voice. He said, "This is my village. I have been here for years and nothing has changed. It is still as poor as dirt. Go through this banana grove and go straight to the bamboo grove at the end of the village, and you will be home. The village road is still full of potholes. Walk carefully. If you are carrying a heavy load on your body, you will be crippled." Hearing the man say that, the woman nodded in agreement, but the woman seemed to walk more carefully, paying more attention to the road below. While walking, the woman suddenly stopped and looked back, her eyes looking worried. Seeing this, the man walking next to her asked, "What's wrong? Why did you stop and look back while you were walking?" The woman was a little startled and turned back to the man and said, "I'm walking, but why do I feel like someone is following me? How strange." The man frowned slightly and scolded the woman. "You're just good at imagining things. It's freezing cold outside, and it's only 4 in the morning. What are you doing here at this hour and following me? Let's hurry up, and we'll be home soon." Hearing the man say that, the woman did not say anything more. Her eyes lit up, her eyes filled with happiness, faith, and hope. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew, making both of them shiver. The man grumbled because he did not understand why there was such a cold wind that chilled them to the bone. The woman continued to walk forward without saying another word. The two of them continued walking straight towards the bamboo bushes at the end of the village where their relatives were waiting for them to return. Behind them, the shutters still creaked with each gust of wind. The banana leaves still swayed and fluttered. The mist slowly drifted with the wind. It seemed that among the mist, there were faint figures like human figures, but also like smoke that floated and then disappeared. Those two people are Tang and In Hung. Tang is the son of Mr. Tan, and Mrs. Lon, and In Hung is the eldest daughter-in-law of Mr. Tan and his wife and Tang's wife. Tang's house is located at the end of the village, quite isolated from the villagers. From Tang's house to a small hamlet where there are about 20 families living, one has to go quite a distance. Because the land where Tang's family lives, the villagers still tell each other that it is haunted. People say that in the past, there was a couple who lived on this land very happily. Suddenly, one day, a tyrant in the village sent someone to arrest the husband. A few days later, he carried his body and threw it in front of the house. Then he quietly left without any explanation. The girl did not cry. She looked at the henchman with hatred, and then dragged her husband's body into the house herself. That night, when the whole village was sleeping, the house at the end of the village was burning brightly. People shouted to each other to put out the fire, but it was too late. From the burning fire, a laugh like crying came from the fire. From then on, every night, people saw a girl standing at night spreading her hair in the middle of the burnt house, leaving only a vacant lot. Many old people also said that they heard her cursing if anyone dared to come here. No one was allowed to survive, so the land was abandoned, and the houses next to it could not bear it, and had to move to another place to live. Only houses that were far enough away to not hear or see those horrifying scenes could live there. Those are the rumors that there are still 2 families living on that land, Tang's family and Mr. Tam and Mrs. Min's family. Since they lived here, life has been favorable and peaceful, nothing has happened. Mr. Tan and Mr. Tam's families are more closely connected than blood brothers in the family. But in fact, having to live on this land before for the 2 families was just a last resort. That story happened when Mr. Tan and Mr. Tam were still young men. At that time Tang had not even been formed in his mother's womb. At that time, Mr. Tan's family lived at the end of the village next to a river. His parents built a house facing directly out to the river. The river was not very wide because it was only about 30 meters wide from one bank to the other. Mr. Tan's father also built a pond bridge down to the river's edge as a place to bathe. Next to the pond bridge was a large raft of water spinach that his father grew for vegetables to eat. Mr. Tan was originally from here, and his wife, Mrs. Lon, was a mountain person. One time, when they went to the forest to join some young men in the village to cut wood for hire, they fell in love and decided to get married. Although Mr. Tan's parents did not seem very pleased, they eventually agreed to their son's wishes. Although Mrs. Lon was a mountain girl, she was very knowledgeable and learned the customs and lifestyle of the lowland people very quickly. Moreover, she was diligent and filial to her husband's parents, so her parents-in-law had increasingly good feelings for their daughter-in-law. Everyone in the village praised Mr. Tan for his good eyesight and his ability to marry a wife who was both beautiful and virtuous. When Mr. Tan's parents saw this, they were very happy. From then on, the family was always filled with laughter. But just 1 year after Mr. Tan married Mrs. Lon, disaster suddenly struck his family. It was the 7th month of the rainy season, and the river water rose very high. Never before had there been such a long and heavy rain like this year. Water from upstream poured down, flowing rapidly. The river was red, and the water overflowed and flooded the yard. That day, Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lon went to the neighboring village early in the morning to work for a rich family. It was not until dark that they returned home. At that time, a sudden storm broke out, signaling that another heavy rain was about to fall. When they got home, both of them were very surprised because normally at this time, the two of them would be sitting in front of the oil lamp with the dinner tray ready, waiting for the couple to come home to eat. But today, the house was dark and they called out to each other, but there was no answer. The couple searched everywhere, but could not find their parents. It started to rain. Mr. Tan planned to go to the neighbors' houses to see if his parents had come to visit them. But the rain got heavier and heavier, and the storm grew so fierce that Mr. Tan and his wife could only wait until the rain stopped before they could go look for their parents. To reassure himself, Mr. Tan also thought that his parents might have gone to the neighbors' houses to play because the rain was so heavy, so he stayed and waited until the rain stopped before returning. 2 hours later, it rained. He waited for a long time, but still did not see his parents return. Mr. Tan's heart started to burn. He ran from house to house in the neighborhood, but did not see them, feeling that something bad was going on. He went to the riverbank in front of the house, where there were some large rocks that his father had placed to make steps where Mr. Tan used to go to the river to bathe every day, but now it was submerged because the river water had risen so high that it was level with the top stone. It was dark. Mr. Tan tried to hold the flashlight in his hand and wave it back and forth around the garden, then shine it out to the river. Suddenly he stopped at a place where something black and round was quite large, swaying right in the middle of his family's water spinach raft. Looking closer, he realized that it was the basket his father used every day to swim out to the raft to pick vegetables or spread nets to catch fish. Realizing that the basket was empty, his heart beat faster. He felt confused and scared. He guessed that the worst thing could have happened. Usually after using the basket, his father usually took it away. He took it out behind the house, and only when he needed it did he pull it out. For a long time he had never seen his father leave the basket on the raft of vegetables, because his father was very careful. Without any hesitation, Mr. Tan jumped straight into the river and swam straight to the basket. The distance between the raft of vegetables and where Mr. Tan was standing was not too far. Although the water was flowing strongly, with many years of living with the river and being a young man, his strength was enough to swim to the basket safely. When he got there, he saw that on the basket there were still a few fish, some water spinach, and his mother's sandals. Mr. Tan was stunned. He screamed for his parents, screaming and crying like a child, echoing throughout the river. Inside the house, Mrs. Lon heard her husband's screams and knew something was wrong, so she ran straight to where the flashlight was shining. When she got there, she saw Mr. Tan swimming to the shore. He looked at his wife with red eyes, 2 streams of tears flowing in despair. Kneeling on the ground, he kept blaming himself for being unfilial, for not being able to take good care of his parents. 3 days later, his parents' bodies were found about 2 kilometers from his house. In their last moments, they still held each other tightly, refusing to let go. Seeing that scene, many people could not help but feel sorry, but for some faint-hearted people, it was also terrifying. At this time, their bodies were swollen and their faces were pale white. What made people even more afraid was that when they died, both of them did not close their eyes. Their eyes were still wide open. It seemed that before they died, they had encountered something very scary. That fear seemed to still remain in their eyes, even though their bodies had been soaked in water for 3 days. In the days that followed, Mr. Tan still could not explain the death of his parents. His father had just turned 50 years old. His health was still quite strong and resilient, not much less than that of a young man. Since he was a child, he grew up with this river. His father had saved people from drowning several times. Even people who were as fat as 70 kilos were pulled to shore. However, his mother was small, only about 40 kilos, but why was his father swept away with her, and the two of them died hugging each other? Another strange thing was that he had never seen his father let his wife row a boat out to the river. He did not even let her go with him because she was a mountain person who had grown up with the mountains and forests since she was a child. She did not understand the river and water, so it would be dangerous if she accidentally fell into the water. Yet on that fateful day, he let her row the boat out to the river, and it was during a storm when the river water rose high. The boat did not capsize, but the two of them sank into the cold river. He could not find a reasonable answer. Tan suddenly recalled an old story. At that time he was still a 16-year-old boy. It was dusk when his family started to prepare dinner. Then outside the alley appeared an old beggar woman leaning on a stick, wearing ragged clothes, a conical hat on her head, slowly walking in front of his house, her face still bowed. The hat covered her entire face, so it was impossible to see what the old woman's face looked like. The old woman walked over and held out a bowl, her mouth mumbling, "Give me a bowl of rice, I haven't had anything to eat for days. Please do me a favor, I'm so hungry." Mr. Tan's parents were both kind people, so when the old beggar woman finished speaking, his mother immediately scooped up a bowl of hot rice, added a few fish and some vegetables, and brought it out to the old woman. "My family doesn't have much, just this much. Sit down and eat. Just eat until you're full. If there's still not enough, I'll scoop more." His mother politely handed the bowl of rice to the old woman. The old beggar woman took the bowl of rice from Mr. Tan's mother. She glanced at the tray of rice where Mr. Tan and his father were also sitting. The pot of rice didn't have much. The 3 people eating must still be hungry. On the tray there were only a few small fish and a few boiled water spinach. The old beggar woman must have been very hungry, so in just a flash the full bowl of rice was gone. Both his parents and Mr. Tan were very surprised, but even if they were hungry they couldn't eat that fast. Seeing the old woman eating so fast, thinking that she was still hungry, Mr. Tan's mother was about to take the bowl of rice to get more rice for her when the old woman waved her hand. Her mouth slightly open smiled at her mother with gentle eyes, but immediately after that the old woman showed a serious attitude and said, "Seeing that your family is kind, I want to give you some advice because you are good people, so consider this your last chance." Hearing that, Mr. Tan's mother seemed a bit surprised, her eyes somewhat confused. "Yes, if you have anything to teach us, just tell us, we will listen." The old beggar woman shook her head slightly and said, "This land where your family lives has a lot of negative energy, accumulated for hundreds of years. This place used to be a burial place for the dead, generals who had contributed to the country. When your ancestors moved here to settle down, they noticed the presence of ghosts here. Instead of building a temple to worship them, burning incense for them, maybe nothing would happen, but your family did the opposite, even suppressed this land, causing them to be imprisoned for many years, hungry, thirsty, and cold. Now I see that the suppression spell is about to lose its effect on them. Then they will take revenge on your family because your family is the descendant of those who suppressed them. The father ate salty food. The son was thirsty. The previous generation created karma. The next generation had to bear the karma. Now it's too late. The only way is to leave this land. This land cannot be stayed. Otherwise the family will encounter disaster. Not normal disaster, but great disaster." After hearing what the old beggar woman said, Mr. Tan's mother's face showed confusion and worry. Although she still did not understand everything the old woman said, she also began to tremble. She looked into the house and looked at his father with fear. Mr. Tan and his father, who had been sitting in the house since earlier, had witnessed the entire conversation between his mother and the old beggar woman. With an unhappy and rather annoyed expression, his father scolded the old woman. "Hey, you're a hungry old woman. You came here to beg for food from our family. We ourselves don't have enough food to eat, but we don't feel sorry for you. You gave you food, but after you ate, you cursed my family to meet with disaster, spoke ill of my ancestors, and even forced my family to abandon the land our ancestors left behind." "What do you mean by that?" The old beggar lady heard Mr. Tan's father say that and still stood still, as if she wanted to say something, but Mr. Tan's father immediately said, Okay, you finished eating, please go away. From now on, don't come back here again. You should use those nonsense stories to tell the children, so you can scare them. But I don't believe the ghost stories you mentioned. My family has been living here peacefully and happily for so long, there's nothing wrong with them. Please go away now. The old beggar woman did not say anything more at this time. She turned away, muttering, shaking her hat back and forth. What a pity, what a pity. The old beggar woman left, but Mr. Tan's mother was still haunted by the old woman's somewhat creepy words. Her eyes were still quite bewildered. Mr. Tan's father appeared very calm after the incident just now. He reassured his wife. Oh my, I hate the way of scaring people. I have never believed in ghosts in this world. I only believe when I see them, and besides, the old woman is old, has no food, lacks a place to sleep, and probably has dementia and talks nonsense. You see, our family has never had any problems here. Don't think nonsense and get too scared and lose sleep. It's really a sin to do good deeds. Mr. Tan's mother heard her husband say that and thought back. It made sense because for many years, the family has always been peaceful. Mr. Tan's family was born and raised on this land. Although not rich, the family has always been warm and happy. That incident gradually faded into oblivion as the following years his family continued to live happily on that land, and from then on no one in his family saw that old beggar woman again. There was one thing that Mr. Tan always wondered about, and he never found the answer to. That day, when the old beggar woman walked out of the gate, he did not know why he was curious to see if the old woman would raise her head or take off her hat when she walked out. Because if she kept her head down like that, how would she walk? The old woman's figure had just disappeared behind the bamboo gate when he ran to the edge of the gate. Standing inside, he gently poked his head out to look out into the alley, but he could not see the old woman anywhere. The old woman had disappeared from his sight. Why could the old woman walk so fast? His house was at the end of the alley, through which his house was a river. The distance from his house to the turn to the other house was quite a long distance. Even if a healthy young man ran with all his might, he could not disappear from his sight so quickly, let alone the old beggar woman, who was leaning on a stick, dragging each step heavily. That was impossible. The road was clear, and there was no sign of her. Where he could hide, he could not explain the strange things he witnessed with his own eyes. He also did not tell his parents for fear that his father would scold him. The next day, he also asked his friends in the neighborhood about the beggar woman, if she had entered anyone else's house or if anyone had seen her, but all his friends in the neighborhood shook their heads and said that no beggar woman had entered their house. Yesterday they gathered at the end of the alley to play all night, but they did not see any beggar woman passing by. There were so many thoughts in his head that he could not explain. His house was deep in the alley. If the beggar woman had entered the alley, she must have entered the houses outside the neighborhood first. Why did she only enter his house? All his friends playing at the end of the alley did not see the old woman walking very slowly with a cane in her hand. At that time, he was confused and tried to find every way to explain the matter, but no matter what, he could not find a reason. Gradually, he did not care about it anymore. A few years after meeting the old beggar woman, his family was always happy and joyful. He married a gentle wife. Everything was normal until today when his parents died at the same time in an inexplicable way. As he sat thinking back to the story of the old beggar woman, he suddenly shivered and felt scared. It seemed like he had somewhat found an answer to the old beggar woman's story. He could confirm that she was definitely not a human. Mr. Tan's parents passed away after a while, so they didn't understand why his land was originally located on the alluvial land, but after a heavy rain, the land in the garden kept eroding into the river. One morning, when Mr. Tan and his wife were still sleeping, there was a loud bang, the sound of the land eroding into the river, but it seemed like this time it was a very large landslide. The couple ran out in panic, and half of the garden had flown into the river. But what was more terrifying was that after the landslide, several stone tombs were revealed, and the tombstones were all still intact, engraved in Chinese characters. Mr. and Mrs. Tan were extremely scared and worried, because they didn't know how many more graves like that were deep inside her house. So for a long time, her family had been living on top of the dead. He told the story to Mrs. Lon. After he finished telling the story, Mrs. Lon was also scared to the point of turning pale, and so the two of them decided to move to another place to live, leaving behind their father's land. The place Mr. Tan chose was the land at the end of the village. the land right next to the road, quite open. In front of it were some large bamboo bushes where people going to work in the fields often sat to avoid the sun on summer afternoons. Although during the day, that place was an ideal place for people to gather to avoid the sun, because in the summer this place was usually very cool because of the large bamboo bushes, and also did not understand why it was a bit cold. It was where the villagers gathered when it was hot. But that was only during the day. At night absolutely no one dared to go there. People still rumored that the deserted land at the end of the village had a ghost that still lurked there. Every time from 12 o'clock at night to 4 o'clock in the morning, if anyone passed by there, they would see in the middle of the land where there were dense bushes the shadow of a girl wearing a white shirt, long hair loose down to the heels, standing there spreading hair, laughing and crying, extremely creepy. Stories like that are passed from person to person, so absolutely no one dares to live there even though the land is in a very beautiful location near the main road suitable for business. In fact, there was a time before when the rich man Dan in the village also planned to clean up and level the land to make a resting place for passers-by, but every time he hired people to destroy the trees and clean up, something unfortunate happened. The tree cutters had just enthusiastically cut down 1 or 2 small trees, when somehow they used their knives to cut right into their own legs. Worse still, one of them even used his knife to cut right into the back of the person cutting in front of them. The women who were hired to cut weeds around the land were enthusiastically cutting grass when from the dense grass, a pure white snake with a bright red crest on its head like a rooster's crest, eyes like 2 pieces of coal, slowly raised its head, stretched its neck, stared at each person, and then hissed a few times, acting very fierce. When the women saw this, they screamed loudly and threw away all their knives and sickles and ran away without even taking their wages. After that incident, a few women in the grass-cutting team suddenly got sick with a fever for several days. Since then, that land has been left unattended. The government announced that they would give free land to anyone who wanted to live there, but after many years it was still abandoned like that. The scene became more and more desolate and cold. Many people in the village, when they had to pass by at around 1 a.m., they all witnessed the scene of the girl standing with her hair spread in the middle of the wild land overgrown with weeds. But she had absolutely never harmed anyone if that person had not violated that land. At first, Mrs. Lon was very scared. She panicked when she heard Mr. Tan say that her family would move to the land at the end of the village. Mrs. Lon had only been here as a daughter-in-law for a while. But where did that land at the end of the village go, and no one was gossiping? Mrs. Lon worriedly asked her husband, "Why don't we ask for another place? There's so much land in this village. Why do we ask for that place, so many people have planned to live there, but if the ghost doesn't let us live, how can we live there?" Mr. Tan looked at her with sad eyes. He was born and raised in this land, and was no stranger to the ghost stories that the villagers had woven. However, just a few days ago, Mrs. Lon informed him that she was pregnant. Currently, they had no money. He understood that he had to give his mother and child a house to settle down in, so that Mrs. Lon and her child would suffer less. If they left the country now, his whole family would definitely wander the streets. The land his father left behind would definitely not be able to live on anymore. The old beggar woman's warning had now come true. Moreover, the land had now eroded and was almost at his yard. Soon, his house would probably be under the muddy river. After thinking for a moment, he gently said, "I also told the government and explained everything, but they didn't give it to me. They said that the land was in a good location and could be used for business, and that it was convenient for the main road. In the future, if the government built an interprovincial road, we could make a lot of money. I know that what they said was just an excuse. Now we can go ask for land for free, and they will give it to us, so we can take it and find a place to build a temporary house. Wait a while, then we will have money and move to another place." Suddenly thinking of something, he exclaimed, "Oh my God, I forgot, don't worry, this time it's not just our family that's out there. This morning, I also met a couple who came from far away and heard that their hometown was flooded and their house was washed away, so they wandered everywhere begging to make a living. When they got here, they heard that the villagers only had a piece of abandoned land with no one living there, so they asked the government for a place to build a small house to protect them from the sun and rain. So the government divided that land in half, giving their family and theirs each half. When Mrs. Lon heard Mr. Tan say that, she felt more secure because in the future there would be neighbors. At least it wouldn't be just the couple in the middle of a deserted piece of land. She sighed. It's true that many people have such miserable fates. They are in the same situation as us, with no way to go, so they have to live on that piece of land. But do you know where they are from? Mr. Tan saw that his wife's face was somewhat less tense. He happily recounted. I asked him, and he said his name was Tam, from the central region. Knowing that we would be neighbors in the future, he seemed quite happy because there were neighbors who could help each other in times of need. We sat and talked for a while, and I told him about the ghost there. He told me to rest assured that his father used to be a shaman. He had learned a little, but he assured me that he could do this. Hearing this, Mrs. Lon also felt more relieved. She used to be a girl from the mountainous region. She had witnessed many scenes of shamans catching ghosts. She still believed in ghosts, but also believed that there would be a shaman who could cure ghosts. She didn't understand why she had never met the new neighbor, but she had faith that he could do it. She could live peacefully on that land. The next morning, the government invited both families to come out to divide the land into half for each family. This vacant land was quite spacious, so dividing it in half was still enough to build a large house, and in front was a garden for growing crops. After measuring and marking the boundary, the government left, leaving the two families. They stood looking at each other and smiling happily. Each person's face radiated joy and hope. Mr. Tan spoke first. Hello, my name is Tan. I am 30 years old, and this is my wife. Her name is Lon. She is 29 years old. In response to Mr. Tan, the husband on the other side also spoke up. Then I would like to introduce myself. My name is Tam, 28 years old. My wife's name is Min, 26 years old. My hometown is in the central region. Our house was swept away by flood, so we drifted here and hope you can help me. Mr. Tan smiled and said, Then I am 2 years older than Mr. Tam. I will be your brother. From now on, we are brothers and neighbors, helping each other. The two men shook hands and laughed happily. Mr. Tan turned to the two women and said, You two get to know each other, then we'll go and discuss how to clean up this place. The two men walked and pointed, standing in the middle of the field, talking excitedly. While they were talking excitedly, Mr. Tam suddenly stopped and looked into the grass. His eyes were a bit scared. In the big bush in the middle, there was a large incense bowl placed on a small mound of earth. Next to it appeared the figure of a girl wearing a white outfit with long hair reaching her heels. Her figure was as blurry as smoke, staring at the two people. It seemed that the ghost realized that Mr. Tam had seen her, so she turned her face straight towards Mr. Tam and smiled. Her eyes were white and cloudy, gradually fading away. After a moment of panic, Mr. Tam regained his composure. Seeing Mr. Tam's slightly bewildered eyes, Mr. Tan patted his shoulder and turned to ask, What's wrong? While we were talking, I asked him a few questions, but he didn't answer, but just stared at it like a lost soul. Mr. Tan patted his shoulder. Mr. Tam was startled, seeing Mr. Tam's strange expression. Mr. Tan turned his eyes to where Mr. Tam had just been staring, feeling a little cold because the incense bowl on the mound of earth seemed to be emitting smoke even though there wasn't a single incense stick stuck on it. Only then did Mr. Tam look at Mr. Tan. The two of them looked at each other with eyes as if they understood what each other wanted to say. Both of them turned back to look at the two wives who were still chatting away as if they had known each other for a long time. The two men were very happy to see that, suddenly after the incident, the two miserable families met again and tried together again. Mr. Tam spoke up to Mr. Tan. I think we should put everything aside here for today. We shouldn't discuss about moving into this land. We have to ask permission from the owner of this place first. Hearing Mr. Tam say that, Mr. Tan didn't understand what Mr. Tam was saying, because the government had already granted the two families certificates of legal ownership of these two pieces of land, so they were the owners. Who else could come here? Seeing Mr. Tan's confused eyes, Mr. Tam gestured with his hand to his mouth, signaling silence, telling Mr. Tan not to ask any more questions. Suddenly understanding something, he nodded and quietly walked out. That night, Mr. Tan and his wife told Mr. Tam and his wife to temporarily return to the house where Mr. Tan and his wife were staying. The two families would stay here for a few days before building a new house at the end of the village. The two families sat together around a simple meal. Late at night, the two women went to bed. Mr. Tan was still sitting on the porch, reminiscing about the days he lived here, peaceful and happy. But in a moment, he lost everything. His parents would soon follow, and this house would also disappear. No one would remember that this place used to be a happy home. The sadness was clearly shown on his face. Mr. Tam, inside the house, saw that Mr. Tan had not slept yet but was sitting there thinking deeply, so he went outside. Mr. Tan heard footsteps and turned around, suddenly remembering what happened during the day. He immediately asked, "What happened this morning that you looked so serious? And you signaled me not to speak. And when I stepped into that area, I had a creepy feeling." Mr. Tam then slowly answered Mr. Tan's question. "Actually, when we went close to that land, I saw a girl wearing a white outfit with long hair reaching her heels standing behind those bushes staring at us. Seeing that, I knew that this was the spirit of the girl that the villagers often rumored. Her eyes were not very friendly, as if she did not want us to be on that land." Mr. Tan worriedly asked, "So what should we do now? Do we really have to leave this land? Many people have wanted to take this land before because it is a good land located in a quite favorable location, but every time there were problems, I'm afraid we will be the same." Mr. Tam confidently looked at Mr. Tan and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of this. We won't go anywhere. I'll find a way. She definitely won't disturb our two families. You can trust me." The next morning, Mr. Tam asked Mr. Tan and his wife to buy some rooster blood and the blood of a black dog. Then Mr. Tam stayed in his room all day alone. No one knew what he was doing. When Mr. Tan asked, he only said that he was sitting there writing down and remembering the prayers his father had taught him for the ghosts, afraid that if he made the wrong prayers, the ghosts would not accept them and would destroy the two families' lives. A few days later, at dusk, the villagers of Thuong were bustling again in the middle of the wasteland at the end of the village. Candles were lit around the village in a circle. In the middle was an altar and a young man. That young man was Mr. Tam. He was ringing a bell and muttering something unclear. The incense smoke billowed out, making the space seem magical. The villagers were surprised and came out to see. After Mr. Tam finished the ceremony, he raised a porcelain jar with yellow talismans stuck around it. He muttered and put the lid on top of it, sticking a talisman that seemed to be written in blood. After that, Mr. Tam went to the small hole he had prepared in advance and buried the jar and covered it up. Looking at Mr. Tam performing the ceremony, Mrs. Lon whispered to Mr. Tan, "Honey, why do I think this ceremony is similar to the ceremony to suppress the dead in my hometown in the past? People capture and lock the ghost in a jar and lower it down so that the trapped ghost cannot harm the living anymore. But if the ghost escapes, it will take revenge. Very scary." Hearing Mrs. Lon say that, Mr. Tan immediately explained, "It's not like that. My uncle told me to ask the ghost to let the two families live here. Then we will build a temple to worship the ghost with incense and smoke, and that jar is to be buried between the two plots of land of our house to avoid outside ghosts from disturbing us." After Mr. Tam finished the ceremony, the two families began to demolish the overgrown bushes. The villagers were curious and worried, waiting to see if the same things as before would happen to these two families again, but absolutely nothing unusual happened. Both families continued to clean up smoothly. By late afternoon, the work was almost complete. All four people were happy, because everything was going smoothly. With this situation, they could start building their houses by tomorrow. They would have a new place to live in a prime location convenient for trading and traveling. The work continued smoothly. A few days later, the villagers saw two thatched houses built in the middle of the wasteland. Between the two houses, a small shrine appeared. The lives of the two families continued to flow smoothly. Less than a year later, Mrs. Lon gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The grandparents named him Tang. With the addition of a new member, both families were filled with the sound of happiness. The joy continued to double a year later. Mrs. Min, Mr. Tam's wife, also gave birth to a son for him, named Tin. The two families and the two children went through the years. They loved and helped each other. Time passed by in a flash. Tan and Tin were also in their 20s, although their family was poor, but both had a healthy, tall, muscular body and were known to be hard-working, diligent, and obedient, so everyone in the neighborhood loved them. So everyone in the village who had daughters wanted to marry them off. A few years later, both Tang and Tin got married. Tang married In Hung, a girl in the lower village. In Hung was young, although her family was not rich, but they had enough food and clothing. She was the youngest daughter in the family, so no matter what, In Hung was pampered by her parents more than her older siblings. In Hung appeared to be obedient and was very popular with the neighbors because of her extremely skillful way of speaking and behaving. Although she did not have to work hard in the fields, she was also very diligent in sewing and embroidering at home, and Hung's embroidery skills were also ranked as famous in the area. Tang loved In Hung because of her talent for embroidery and her voice that sounded like honey to In Hung's ears. Tin married Hoa. Hoa's family was poor, not like Tang's wife and Hung. Her father died early, her mother was sick and bedridden. She had to take care of every meal and earn money to treat her mother's illness, so she looked dark and skinny. Tin also loved Hoa because she saw that she was a good daughter who was filial to her parents. She accepted to marry Hoa, and together with Hoa, she took care of her old mother. The two families of Mr. Tan and Mr. Tam had lived together like siblings, so Tang and Tin grew up together and considered each other as siblings. That's why the two weddings were held on the same day. Everyone in the village admired the close relationship between the two families and was happy for Mr. Tan and Mr. Tam. After many years of painful fate, their children were now grown up and they had enjoyed the sweet fruits. But the wedding was only a few months old when an incident happened to all the people in the area. At that time, it was around the 8th lunar month and it rained continuously for a whole month. The whole village of Thuong was now submerged in water. All the crops had rotted. All the crops in the fields and gardens had been washed away by the water. In September, the rain had somewhat stopped, but every time the water receded a little, a few days later there was another heavy rain. The water level rose again as before. And so it went on for the whole of September. After 2 months, the whole village was still submerged in water. The rice reserves were gradually exhausted, and the young men in the village had also left to find work elsewhere to buy rice to feed their families. Tin then saw that the rice in the house was almost gone, and estimated that if they continued to stay at home, in just a few weeks the whole family would have nothing to eat and would be in a state of hunger. Tin immediately went to see Tang, and invited Tang to go to the district to find more work. The next day, the two of them went to the district to find work. They wandered around but couldn't find any work because of the flood and people had no jobs, so they flocked to the district to work. Everywhere they saw people looking for jobs, many of them even looking for jobs just to earn a living and not for a salary. Tang and Tin were forced to find a job that paid enough to buy rice to feed their families because they both understood that at home, their parents and wives were both counting on the two young men in the family. After walking for a while, they were both tired and hungry. They sat down to rest under a tree by the roadside, their eyes half closed. Suddenly, they were startled when someone called out right in front of them. "Hey, you two, where are you going? Why are you sleeping here?" The two opened their eyes and saw a fat bald man with tattooed arms and legs with images of birds, wild animals, and water. He looked at the two young men from top to bottom and then raised his chin and asked, "Are you two looking for a job?" Hearing the fat man's question, Tang quickly replied, "Yes, we are looking for a job, but we can't find one." The fat man smiled and looked at the two men carefully and said, "Then you two come with me for an easy job with a high salary. I will provide food and accommodation, and give each of you 500 a month. Do you agree?" Tang and Tin seemed to not believe the fat man's words. Food and accommodation are provided and 500,000. With the current price of rice, they only need to work for 1 month to be able to buy a ton of rice for the whole family to eat and not be afraid of hunger anymore. Tin still didn't seem to believe it, so he asked again in a more reserved tone, What did you say? Food and lodging are provided, and you get 500 a month. Is that true? But tell us why it's so high." The fat guy laughed out loud, rubbed his shiny head, and said in a deep voice, "Don't worry, the work is easy and the salary is high. You just need to do what I say and you'll be fine. Whatever I say, just do it exactly as I say." With such a generous salary, there was no need to hesitate anymore, and without asking what they were doing, the two accepted the fat guy's offer, because they were afraid that if they asked too much, he would not hire them anymore, and they would lose a very lucrative job. The two followed him to the work area. That fat guy was no stranger to the people in this area. He was the boss of a gambling and loan sharking ring, and his main occupation was drug trafficking. His ring was the biggest in this area. He had a lot of money and a lot of connections, so no one dared to touch him. Even some officials sometimes had to respect him a little. Today on the way, he accidentally passed by Tang and Tin, who were resting under a tree. He guessed that these two guys were from the countryside looking for a job. Looking at their bright faces, tall and muscular, he immediately had the idea of bringing them both back to work for him, because with his keen eye for people, he knew for sure that these two guys would be quite good at the job. Stopping at the end of the alley, he told the two to wait, and then he approached a room with a door made of corrugated iron that was quite old but still quite sturdy. He raised his hand and banged on the door. The corrugated iron door made the sound of the door quite loud, which startled Tang and Tin a bit. While banging, he called out in a loud voice that was just as loud as the sound of the door. "Open the door! Open the door!" He called out so abruptly that he couldn't clearly call anyone's name. After a while, the door opened slightly. Inside, 3 young men who were quite tall and big, with various types of injuries on their arms, legs, and even their faces, opened the door to greet the fat guy and then stood aside. The fat guy looked around the room a bit and then said to the 3 other juniors, "These are the 2 new guys I just hired to work with. From now on, they will stay here with the 3 of you. Tonight, you guys show them how to deliver goods." The other 3 guys said yes and nodded repeatedly. The fat guy walked back out when he passed Tang and Tin. He patted them on the shoulder and said, "The job here requires you to be quick, familiar with the roads. If there is anything you don't know or understand, ask the other guys to show you. If you do well, you will be rewarded," he said and walked away with a happy smile on his face. Tan and Tin were enthusiastically helped by the 3 other guys. In the evening, one of the 3 guys gave them some new clothes and said that the boss gave them 2 sets of clothes to work, which looked very luxurious and quite expensive. The 2 were happy because they saw that the boss cared and was very thoughtful. When they went to work in the evening, Tang and Tin were given specific instructions on the job by a guy. The job was really very leisurely, so leisurely that even Tang and Tin didn't dare to dream of it, just receiving goods and delivering them to the correct address, only delivering a few times a day and then doing whatever they wanted. Tang and Tin sometimes wondered with the guys who worked with them, but they just said that the boss's goods were all high-value goods, and that he had to be trusted a lot to deliver them, so even though he did little work, he got a high salary because of that. And from then on, the 2 of them officially worked for the fat guy. After a month of working, they found the job was too easy and the income was high. Everything was still going well. The fat guy paid them as promised and even gave them a bonus. Tang and Tin were happy to buy rice and bring it home to their families. At home, everyone didn't understand what Tang and Tin did, that they had only been in the district for a month and had earned so much money while in the village. Many people also went to the district to work for hire but only had enough for a meal. Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lan asked a few times, but Tang just said that he was lucky to meet a good boss who treated them well. The job was just delivering goods every day. Several months later, Tang and Tin's work continued according to the rules of receiving and delivering goods without any incident. Both of them did their jobs well, so the fat guy also increased their salaries generously. They both became more and more popular with the fat guy. He arranged for Tang and Tin to stay in his area to make it easier to handle shipments that required faster people. One time, Tang passed by the fat guy's room and accidentally heard the fat guy whispering to his trusted disciple. On the table was a piece of paper with something written on it. The 2 were so engrossed in their discussion that they didn't notice Tang's presence. The fat guy's voice shouted, "Of course we have to go, but calm down, wait until after this batch. I will bring both Tang and Tam. The digging job requires strong and hard-working people to be able to do the job. If we succeed, we will definitely be rich." The 2 of them continued to whisper very softly. Outside, Tang slowly recited the places that the fat guy and the disciple had just mentioned. Tang took out a pen and paper to write them down and hid them in a secret place. A few days later, Tang asked for leave to return to his hometown. The fat guy was a bit surprised, but Tang said the reason was that he had family matters that needed to be resolved, and then he would return to work. Seeing that, the fat guy didn't suspect anything. He paid Tang in full when he got home. He greeted his parents and then went straight into the room with Hung. Mr. Tan saw Tang's furtive eyes and was surprised because since he was little, Tang had never had that kind of look. Since the day Tang went to the district and earned a lot of money to support the whole family, he also realized that Tang's thoughts had also changed a bit. Tang seemed to be less talkative and more taciturn. His eyes also had a strange look compared to before, knowing that, but Tang was always polite and worried about his family, so he kept quiet and let it go. Entering the room, Hung asked loudly, "What's going on? That sounds so secretive. Did you get a raise again?" Tang put his hand to his mouth and signaled Hung to speak more softly. Tang told Hung the story he had overheard and told her his intention. After hearing that, Hung's eyes lit up, showing her joy. Hung whispered into Tang's ear, "Go, I definitely have to go. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is the chance for us to change our lives. That fat guy, according to you, has to go through several more shipments before he can drag people up there to search. If we go and return within a few months, we definitely won't meet them. And Hung's words were like urging words that made Tang's determination to find gold even stronger. Tang slammed his hand on the bed and said firmly, "I will make a list of the necessary items for this trip. Tomorrow morning, you and I will go to the market to buy them. I have saved up some money, but it probably won't be enough. You can go to the district to sell the necklace that your parents gave you as a dowry for travel expenses and living expenses. If you have money to redeem it later, it's okay." And Hung did not hesitate, even though it was a dowry her parents gave her as a souvenir when she got married. Tang lay with his hands on his forehead, thinking about the plans for the trip. It could change Tang into the richest man in the city like the fat guy had said. He was absent-mindedly startled when he heard In Hung's voice calling. "Hey, you, I told you something. Why are you calling so urgently?" Being interrupted in his train of thought, Tang slightly scolded, and Hung continued to ask cautiously, "So you and Uncle Tin work in the same place and have been close friends for a long time. Did you invite him to join us on this trip?" Tang sighed and said, "The other day I called him and told him I had a business relationship far away. I didn't say it clearly. I was going to look for gold and invited him and his wife to come with me. But he refused. He said that working there would be a salary. And he also asked for Ms. Hoa to work at a restaurant near where you and your wife were working, so she wouldn't be able to follow us." And Hung let out a sigh, but that sigh did not carry sadness or disappointment, but a sigh of relief. As planned, the next day Tang and In Hung packed up and left for a long-distance job. Tang bought enough rice for his parents to eat for a while, leaving some money for them in case of any unexpected events. Then the couple said goodbye to them and went to work far away, hoping to change their lives. The couple watched their son and daughter-in-law's figures gradually disappear with tearful eyes, not knowing when their children would return to them. The family only had one son, and now that he was gone, only the two of them were left to take care of each other. The two of them were about to turn back into the house when on the other side, Mr. Tam also called out, "Uncle Ton." Uncle Ton, Tang and his wife, did they go to the border to trade? Mr. Ton sadly answered Mr. Tam's question. "Yes, they just left, Uncle. They intended to say hello to the uncle and aunt over there, but when they saw that the uncle and aunt hadn't opened the door yet, they were afraid of disturbing the grandparents' sleep, so they left." Mr. Tam smiled and said, "Yesterday, they also came here to say hello to me. From tomorrow, our two families will cook and eat together like before to make it cozy." Tin and Ho also went to the district this morning. Tin asked for a job next to his workplace, so the children all left, leaving only the old couple. Mr. Tang also spoke up to encourage everyone. Yes, when the children grow up, they will know how to think about the future. They will go to work far away to build a life for themselves. We must live happily and healthily, so that the children can go out and do business with peace of mind. Mrs. Lon said in a tearful voice, "If only our two children worked as hard as Tin and his wife, they would be able to come home to visit sometimes. But Tang and his wife are hundreds of kilometers away from the border. Who knows when they will be able to see their child?" Mrs. Lon said, tears falling one after another. Mr. Ton encouraged his wife. "Why are you crying? Didn't you hear them say that if the work went smoothly, they would come back to you in just 5 months? If they keep crying like that, they won't have any luck at work." So from that moment on, the four of them cooked and ate together, reliving their youth, the first years when the two families moved to the wasteland at the end of the village to live. Time flies. Before leaving, Tang promised his parents that he would return in 5 months. But today Tang and In Hung returned. It has been 10 years. 10 years have passed. Not knowing if his parents are still healthy or not, Tang walked faster. Ahead he saw the bamboo bushes in front of the alley. Arriving and opening the gate, the scenery was still the same even though he had been gone for 10 years, but this place seemed to have not changed at all. The scenery even had a more desolate and old look. Mr. Tam's house was also covered by a white mist drifting on the roof of that house, looking much colder and darker than before. Suddenly Tang shivered a bit when he looked closely at Mr. Tam's house. Tang stepped into the yard. Suddenly Tang and In Hung jumped when from behind the kitchen a shadow of a black animal rushed straight at In Hung's feet. Startled, In Hung screamed loudly and kicked it away. It cried out and ran straight to the front of the house and barked repeatedly like a dog biting. A ghost. It sounded so scary that it gave me goosebumps. It was the dog that. After Tang and his wife went to work far away, Mr. and Mrs. Tan used the money Tang gave them in case they got sick to buy a black dog to both guard the house and keep it company. While sleeping, they heard the sound of Muck barking repeatedly, so loud that both Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lon woke up. but were lying quietly listening. Mrs. Lon whispered into her husband's ear, "It's so strange, isn't it? Why does Muck howl repeatedly at this time these days, as if it saw a ghost? 2 days ago, Muck also howled several times at this time. I felt strange, so I went outside to see if there was anything. You know, I saw on Mr. Tam's roof a very big owl with red eyes, standing next to Mr. Tam's house but looking over to our house. It kept staring at me. I was so scared that I ran inside and closed the door. I was so scared." Hearing what Mrs. Lon said, Mr. Tan was not surprised at all, because last night he himself had witnessed that horrifying scene. But it was even more horrifying than the scene Mrs. Lon had just told him. It was still the sound of the squid howling in long bursts. It was still the owl on Mr. Tam's roof, but it was not an owl with 2 red eyes. The thick fog made him unable to see what it was, but he clearly saw on Mr. Tam's roof, in the hazy fog hovering over the thatched roof, for glowing red eyes that seemed to be looking straight into his eyes. He was so frightened that he was speechless and could not utter a word. Then when he regained his senses, he walked back to his house with trembling legs and slammed the door shut. He was certain that the owl landing on Mr. Tam's house was a bad omen, and more certain that something bad was about to happen to Mr. Tam's house. Thinking so, the next day he planned to go over and talk to Mr. Tam and his wife, but he didn't know where Mr. and Mrs. Tam had gone since early morning until 10 o'clock last night when they came back. It was late, so he didn't go over and decided to go over and tell Mr. and Mrs. Tam what happened this morning. While Mr. Tan was thinking, Mrs. Lon whispered in his ear, "Normally it just barks once or twice and then stops. Why is it barking nonstop today, and it's howling so loudly it sounds so scary?" Mr. Tan was still trying to listen. He clearly heard footsteps approaching the house. He told Mrs. Lon to be quiet. The dog stopped barking. Suddenly it whined and ran to the back of the kitchen, and sat there looking straight at Tang and his wife. Mr. Tan was lying in the house and clearly heard people talking. The voice sounded quite familiar. After a while he heard a call. "Dad, Mom, open the door for me." Mr. Tan had been listening for a while now, and now he realized that although the voice had changed a bit, he still recognized his son's voice. He shouted to Mrs. Lon, "Tang's voice is Tang's voice, Mom, Tang's back." Hearing Mr. Tan say that, Mrs. Lon didn't need to ask anything more and ran straight to the door. As soon as she pulled the door latch open, in front of her eyes were 2 figures with long hair covering their entire faces standing right in front of the house's steps. Mrs. Lon screamed and fell to the ground unconscious. 2 dark shadows rushed into the house and ran to support Mrs. Lon. Mom, what's wrong? Mom, wake up, Tang, we're back." Mr. Tan staggered out, still holding the oil lamp in his hand. The light clearly illuminated the faces of the 2 people supporting Mrs. Lon lying on the ground. Tang stood up and hugged Mr. Tan. "Dad and I have returned. I'm sorry for making you and your parents work so hard all these years. Are you okay?" Mr. Tan hugged his son tightly, patted his son's back, and then sobbed, "Mom and Dad are fine, very fine." Then In Hung helped Mrs. Lon sit up and took her hand. "Mother and son In Hung, you and Tang have returned." Mrs. Lon then calmed down and looked closely at the faces of the 2 people holding her hand. She hugged In Hung and cried and said happily, "Thank God, my son and daughter-in-law are back. Thank God for blessing them to return safely." Then, holding Tang's hand, she scolded emotionally, "Where has your father been? He hasn't come back for so many years. This old couple thought something had happened to you." Then she cried again, tears of happiness of a mother who was reunited with her children after 10 years of absence. Mr. Tan saw that and immediately told Mrs. Lon, Okay, you're telling your children to come back here. What else can you do? Okay, let them change their clothes and go to bed. They can talk freely tomorrow morning." Mrs. Lon immediately ran into the small chest and pulled out some clothes and said, "These are the clothes you 2 left me, and I've kept them here for 10 years. I don't know if they fit, but the clothes you're wearing are dirty. You 2 can wear them for now and go to bed to rest. We'll figure it out tomorrow." Tang and In Hung both said yes and went into the bedroom to sleep. After 10 years of returning to their old house, Tang and In Hung were actually considered the richest couple in this area. The 2 backpacks they were carrying were a huge fortune because there was a lot of gold in them. The 2 backpacks were so heavy that the couple put them away in a corner of the room and climbed into bed to sleep. It felt so good to return home. Tang and In Hung looked at each other and smiled with satisfaction. Soon, Tang and In Hung would become the richest people in this area. Everyone would be amazed. Many people would admire the couple for their wealth and success. Suddenly, Tang turned around and Hung said, "Go to sleep. Everything has passed. Tomorrow, we will go to the district to sell some gold. It's convenient to see where to buy land on the street. In this village, we can't do any business." Hung looked at Tang lovingly and nodded in agreement. Tang did not respond to that loving gaze but looked up at the roof. Then both of them fell asleep in their hometown after 10 years apart. The next morning when Tang and Hung woke up, it was already past 9 in the morning. Tang and Hung tiredly walked out of the house. Outside, the meal was already prepared. The meal was extremely frugal, with only vegetable soup and pickled eggplant. Looking at the meal, Tang understood how hard his parents had to live over the years. While he was thinking, Mrs. Lon hurriedly walked in from the door and said, "You two get up and eat. We all grew the food at home. Mom just went to the market at the beginning of the village to buy some food. Later, I will invite Mr. Tam and his wife to come over to celebrate your return. Your father is probably sitting there playing now." Tang and his wife looked at each other. Neither of them said anything. After a moment of silence, Tang said, "In a while, my family and I will go to the district town for some important business, about the food and drink party to entertain the relatives. When my husband and I return, you can come back tomorrow night to help me. We have some urgent things to do. I'm afraid we won't have time today." Hearing Tang say that, Mrs. Lon immediately said, "Yes, the party is fine anytime, but where are you rushing to go as soon as you get home? Why don't you rest first?" "Yes, I have some important business. I'll come back after I'm done, Mom." Saying that, Tang and Hung took Mr. Tan's bike and rode to the district town, not forgetting to bring 2 backpacks. That morning when Tang and Hung woke up, it was already past 9 o'clock in the morning. Tang and Hung tiredly walked out of the house. Outside, the meal was already prepared. The meal was very simple, with only vegetable soup and pickled eggplant. Looking at the meal, Tang understood how hard his parents had to live in the past years. While he was thinking, Mrs. Lon hurriedly walked in from the door and said as she walked, "You two get up and eat. The food and soup are all grown by our family. Mom just went to the market at the beginning of the village to buy some food. Later, I will invite Mr. Tam and his wife to come over to celebrate your return. Your father is probably sitting there right now." Tang and his wife looked at each other. Neither of them said anything. After a moment of silence, Tang said, "Later, my family and I will go to the district town for some important business. Or about the food and drink party. Let's come over tomorrow night, Mom. I'm afraid I won't be able to make it today." Hearing Tang say that, Mrs. Lon immediately said, "You just got home and are in a hurry to go somewhere. Why don't you rest first?" Tang immediately replied, "I have some work in the district. I will probably be back late tonight. You two stay home and eat first. Don't wait for your daughter-in-law and her husband." Saying that, Tang and Hung took Mr. Tan's bike and rode to the district town, not forgetting to bring 2 backpacks. Tang and Hung went to the district town to sell gold, because the two of them went straight home on the way back and didn't have time to sell. There were more than a dozen gold and silver shops in the district town, and Hung and Tang stopped by more than a dozen of them, selling a little at each place to avoid the prying eyes of others. After going around more than a dozen gold and silver shops, the amount of money in Tang and his wife's backpack was very large, but the gold in their backpack was not much less. At that time, it was already past 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and Tang and his wife rode back together. The bicycle was quite old, and pedaling was already tiring, let alone carrying Hung sitting on the back with a heavy backpack, but Tang still whistled carefree, his face happy and full of life. Hung sat in the back, hugging her backpack full of money, thinking that from now on she would enjoy happiness for the rest of her life with the gold that she and her husband had, dreaming of a bright future, when Tang's voice startled her. "Tomorrow after the party, we will go to the city to find a really nice house to buy, then bring your parents and my parents to the city to live." Hung whined, "Remember that your wife's contribution is very great. You must feel proud to have a wife like me. Don't fool around with any other girl. You know how much your wife sacrificed for this family." After Hung finished speaking, Tang's face changed a bit, but he still said yes very gently. Behind Hung started to hum some songs, looking very happy, and Hung was happy after many years of struggling with life. Now Hung and Tang had become rich. On the way back, Tang and Hung stopped in front of a large grocery store in the district town to buy a lot of delicious fruits and candies, and rented a cyclo to transport the gifts back to distribute to the neighbors. Tang and Hung bought many luxurious and elegant clothes. Seeing Tang and his wife like that, the villagers all praised them, and they also understood that Tang and his wife were now doing well. Looking at the gifts Tang gave the villagers, they were all expensive cakes. The clothes Tang wore were even things that people couldn't afford to buy in a year. Many people even used Tang and his wife as an example to learn from. Everyone whispered to each other, "Tang and his wife are really good. They have great ambitions and left their homeland to go to the border for a dozen years of hard work. Now that they have returned successfully, Mr. and Mrs. Tan Lan can enjoy their old age to their heart's content." There were many gossips, most of which were words of praise and admiration for Tang and his wife's determination. That afternoon, when Tang and his wife rode their bicycles home, it was already past 7 o'clock in the evening. The winter sky had begun to drizzle. It was raining today, so it was pitch black outside. Tang and his wife rode their bicycles into the yard, but the squid in the kitchen rushed out and started to bite loudly. Its barking was like a howling ghost, very annoying to hear. It seemed like it had not gotten used to the presence of these two new owners. However, when Tang and his wife had entered the house, the dog was still howling long and terrifyingly. Mr. Tan was annoyed and went outside and shouted, "What are you biting so much? If you say no, I'll sell you." But when he stepped out the main door, the squid was not biting Tang and his wife, but it kept looking straight out the gate. Its eyes were directed towards the bamboo bushes and howling. Its two front legs kept scratching the ground as if it wanted to jump out of the gate. Inside the house, Tang heard Mr. Tan yelling several times, but the squid's howling kept on going on and on. Tang called out, "Why does the squid keep biting, Dad?" Mr. Tan was standing outside the yard observing the squid, hearing his son calling him and about to answer, but at that moment the squid whined, tucked its tail and ran straight into the kitchen as if it was afraid of something. Mr. Tan quickly walked into the house and told Tang that his face was a bit tense, but he still acted calm and said to his son, "There must be a cat or a mouse outside the bamboo bushes, so it's barking like that. I don't know what's wrong with this one lately." And Hung had just brought the money into the room. When she went out and saw Mr. Tan say that, and Hung was surprised and asked, "Why is that, Dad? I thought it wasn't used to our presence, so it barked at us." Mr. Tan explained, "This squid has been raised by Dad since it was a baby for 10 years now. It is very smart and obedient. Who wouldn't want it to bite Dad? Just hold it and put it in front of that person, so that person can stroke its head 3 times, and from then on it will never bite again. The other day you touched its head 3 times and it was like this, right? Just now when you two came home, Dad saw it was still barking very fiercely, so Dad ran out from the kitchen to check. When he got to the yard, Dad saw it was looking towards the gate and barking. It wasn't barking at you too." Tang immediately said, "That's right, Dad. When my wife and I came home, it barked loudly, but it was true that it was barking while running behind us towards the gate. It was raining, so I didn't pay attention and just went straight into the house. It must have been the mouse and cat outside the bamboo bushes that annoyed it. That's why it did that." And Hung immediately interrupted, "But since the day my husband and I came back here, I saw that Muck's barking was very strange, Dad. It made me feel creepy. It sounded like a dog biting a ghost." Speaking of this, and Hung suddenly felt a shiver. Tang's face was also a bit tense, realizing that his daughter-in-law's expression seemed scared, so Mr. Tan didn't say anything more inside. Actually, just now outside the gate, there was a detail that Mr. Tan didn't tell Tang and his wife, which was when the muck was barking aggressively and suddenly whined and ran straight into the kitchen. He suddenly saw behind the bamboo bushes in front of the alley a pair of bright red eyes looking straight at his house. He jumped and was about to scream, but in the blink of an eye, those eyes disappeared. He regained his composure and quickly walked into the house. Because he didn't want his children to know about the strange things that had been happening around the land for a week before Tang and his wife returned. A few days later, he felt somewhat uneasy. But since Tang and his wife returned, the incident of the squid howling around 3 in the morning has not happened for 2 nights, and there has been absolutely no owl perched on Mr. Tam's roof. At dinner, Tang took out a large stack of money and gave it to Mr. Tan and said, "This is the money my wife and I gave you to spend. You have worked hard for so long. You can buy whatever you want to eat, and when you are healthy, I will give you more." Looking at the stack of money in Tang's hand, Mr. Tan knew that it was a very large sum of money. He had never saved such an amount of money in his entire life as a hired worker. Mrs. Lan was very surprised. She also did not know how her son could earn so much money. She trembled and said emotionally, "You have worked for so many years to save up a little money, and now you give it all to your parents to take. What do you use to make a living? Just take it. Your parents are old and can't eat or buy much, so why take such a large amount of money? Tang took Mr. Tan's hand and placed the stack of money in his father's hand and said, "You two just take it and spend it comfortably. This money is not worth anything to us now." Mrs. Lon heard her son say that. Her eyes revealed even more worry. She couldn't understand why her son came back with a mountain of money, but in her heart she felt strangely confused and uneasy. She stammered and asked, You two, what business? Where did you get so much money?" Tang's eyes were a bit confused, understanding his mother-in-law's intention, because seeing too much money made him worried, so In-hung quickly said, "Don't worry, Mom. This is all the money from my husband and I's sweat and effort. For the past 10 years my husband and I have been struggling to trade at the border. The first few years we didn't have anything, we also lost everything. But thinking about our family's difficult circumstances in the countryside, we tried to hold on for a few years. Thanks to good luck, and my husband and I do business with prestige and customers' trust, so the money just flows into our pockets like water. That's why we have today. Mom and Dad can rest assured to take it and spend it to make us happy." Hearing her daughter-in-law's explanation, Mrs. Lon felt a little more reassured, but for some reason, she felt restless and she couldn't explain it. The atmosphere at dinner had calmed down a bit when Mr. Tan suddenly asked, breaking the silence, "So, do you two have any plans when you come back this time?" Tang put the bowl down on the tray and answered Mr. Tan, "Yes, this time we plan to buy a house in the district town and bring Mom and Dad to live with us. What do you think?" Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lon looked at each other, and then Mr. Tan continued, "If you want to move to the city, that's good, your parents don't object, but your parents have been attached to this land for a long time, living here and dying here, not going anywhere, and perhaps you two don't know that this is our area. The government will build a new interprovincial road running through it, because the old road is too degraded and has a winding curve, so the decision has been made to run straight through in front of our house. In just a few years our land will become gold and silver, so you guys will have plenty of room to do business." Hearing Mr. Tan say that, both Tang and In-hung were very surprised. In-hung asked again, "Who did you hear this from, or is it a rumor somewhere? Is it true?" Mr. Tan sipped his water and answered his daughter-in-law, "Is it true or not? Yesterday, the provincial officials came down to work and calculated compensation for the houses with large bamboo bushes in front of their houses, and the people also received the compensation money. So what Mr. Tan said is completely true. In just a short time, when the interprovincial road passes in front of our house, the land here will become gold." In-hung glanced at Tang again, understanding what Tang's wife meant, winking back with a happy attitude. Tang and In-hung became even richer. They should have spent a large amount of money to buy land in the district town to do business, but now they don't need to buy any more, and tomorrow, right on their own land, Tang and his wife will be able to do business freely. Tang immediately told his father, "If we could do business at home, there would be no reason for us to go to the city. I would stay and build a big house so that my husband and I could take care of our parents." In-hung also added immediately, "I always tell my husband that we don't lack money now. We have enough to eat and wear, so we should stay in our hometown to take care of our parents. For many years, my husband and I have been working far away from home, and they have worked hard." Hearing their son's words, and especially In-hung's words, Mr. and Mrs. Tan felt warm in their hearts because they had a filial daughter-in-law. Mrs. Lon held her daughter-in-law's trembling hand and said, "Tang is really lucky to have a wife like you. I think that means that when your parents are old, they won't care about anything anymore. This time, you two should come back and settle down and give your parents some grandchildren, because other people have grown-up grandchildren." Mr. Tan immediately added, "That's right, you two should also consider having children, it's not too late. From tomorrow, I will hand over this piece of land to you two to build a house as you wish. Your parents only need a small room to live together until they return to their ancestors." Tang and his wife agreed, then Tang continued, "Actually, I don't think we need to build a house yet. I think we should wait until they finish the road, then it won't be too late to build it. I still have some memories here, so I want to stay in this house to relive my childhood memories for a while longer." Hearing his son say that, Mr. Tan happily nodded and said, "That's right, this house carries so many memories of the whole family that I can't bear to tear it down." Mr. Tan's eyes seemed nostalgic and thoughtful. Suddenly he heard Tang ask, "Oh my God, I've been so busy since I got home these past 2 days that I haven't been able to stop by Uncle Tam's place to ask about your health. My wife and I will visit you later. But why haven't you come over to visit? Normally, you used to come over a few times a day. Mrs. Lon sighed and said, I don't know what's wrong with the weather these days, but Uncle Tam's wife is always sick. I heard Mr. Tam say that she can't sleep and keeps calling out Tin and Hoa's name all day. She must be so miserable that she misses her son so much that she's now sick. Hearing that, Tang was startled, and Hung's face turned pale and she quickly asked Mrs. Lon, Why? Are you missing me? Is there something wrong with Tin and his wife, Mom? Mrs. Lon clicked her tongue and continued, When you two left the country to work far away, Tin also took Hoa to work in the city. I heard that before Hoa could start working, the place where Tin worked was searched by the police and everyone from the boss to the employees were arrested. That incident shocked the whole village. Everyone was saying that that was where Tin worked, but he must have heard about it in advance, so he took his wife and disappeared. The police even came to their house to look for her, but since then they have disappeared and have not been seen since. Tang and his wife looked at each other, their eyes filled with tears, looking very sad and heartbroken when hearing the news that their childhood friend was even closer than real brothers in the family. Tang's eyes looked out the door, far away, then he said in a sad tone, Life is unpredictable. Years ago I told them to leave that place and go do business with us, but they didn't listen. That's why this happened. I don't know if they are alive or dead now. And Hung looked at Tang's face, her hands clutching her husband's shoulders, her face clearly pale and tired. Mr. Tan looked at him now, very sad and sorrowful. He used to consider Mr. Tam more than a blood brother. Now, looking at Mr. Tam's family situation, he couldn't help but feel sorry. Feeling sorry but unable to help, he could only go visit and encourage them. Every day, he went several times to see if Mr. and Mrs. Tam needed help, and he would help. He always went to the communal shrine between the two families' land to pray for his and Mr. Tam's 2 children to return. Now his children have returned, but Mr. Tam's son and daughter-in-law are still missing. Suddenly, Mr. Tan spoke up. About a week ago, my grandparents were still healthy. Both sides of the family still contributed rice to cook together. But suddenly Mrs. Tam had been having nightmares for several days. Then she didn't want to eat or drink anything, just cried all day long, calling Tin and Hoa's name. Then she fell ill and was bedridden, not eating or drinking anything, just tired. And sleeping, but when she woke up, she cried, had to give her sedatives to make her sleep. I don't understand what sins my grandparents have done to be so miserable at the end of their lives. Mr. Tan just said, his 2 hands rubbed together, his eyes filled with tears as if he was about to cry. And Hung saw that Mr. Tan seemed moved, about to ask something but stopped. Then Mrs. Lon spoke up again. The other day, when I went to visit her, she just cried and said that Tin and Hoa died. They died tragically. Then she cried again. I didn't ask much more. Hearing Mrs. Lon tell this, Tang and Hung jumped, as if not believing their ears. Tang asked Mrs. Lon again, What? Mrs. Tam said that Tin and his wife died. It couldn't be like that. I think it was probably because she thought too much and had a crazy dream. And Hung also quickly continued her husband's words. That's right, Mom. It was probably because she was too tired and had a hallucination and had a crazy dream that night. And a dream is just a dream. How can it be considered real? Mrs. Lon shook her head slightly. I also told her a few times that in dreams, life is bad and death is good. It's a dream, not reality. So why think too much? Try to take care of your health and wait for the 2 of them to come back. But no matter how much I advised her, she wouldn't listen, insisting that Tin and his wife were definitely dead. Mr. Tam was also heartbroken, but still tried to be strong to have the strength to take care of her, thinking about them and living a gentle life. Hoping that God would bless the 2 of them to return safely like you and your wife. That would be great. Then Mrs. Lon also turned her face towards the door, sadly. Tang and Hung at that time could only look at each other. The whole house suddenly became silent. Mr. Tan spoke up. You 2 are also coming back today. It's Monday. Then arranged to go over there to visit them properly. When Tang was a baby, they held him and fed him all the time. Tang lowered his head, thinking about something, before he could answer Mr. Tan. And Hung quickly replied, Yes, my husband and I are also planning to go over there to ask about the health of the uncle and aunt there, and also bring them some gifts. Mr. Tang said that we should have gone over yesterday, but because we were so busy, we couldn't go. That afternoon Tang and Hung went to Mr. Tam's house. The house was still the same. Nothing had changed except for the trees around it. The thatched house was also more dilapidated than before. Entering the yard, calling out several times before seeing Mr. Tam tiredly walking out the door, looking so old. His hair was already white, his face was haggard, sadness was clearly shown on his face. He squinted his eyes to see who was coming in. Seeing Mr. Tang, he shouted from afar, "Uncle Tam." "I'm back!" Tang rushed straight to hug Mr. Tam. Mr. Tam was also very happy to see Tang. His voice was joyful. "Tang, you two are back. Oh my God, let me see." Then he stood there looking at Tang and grabbed Tang's hand. Good, it's good to be back." Tang and his wife walked into the house. Inside, Mrs. Tam was sleeping. Tang glanced over at where Mrs. Tam was lying. Seeing that she was much older than Tang's mother, her skin was pale, her face was wrinkled with pain. Tang suddenly felt heartache. He bowed his head to the ground, recalling the days when he was a child, where there were two happy families living together. The bed Mrs. Tam was lying on. He didn't know how many times Tang had slept on it with Tin. Tang felt his nose sting. Tang turned to Mr. Tam and said, "Is Ms. Tam eating anything now, Uncle? I've heard everything from my parents, or tomorrow I'll call a herbalist to come and examine her and give her some tonic medicine." Mr. Tam sadly said, "No need, I know she's still conscious and not sick. I've advised her for a long time, but she doesn't listen. She doesn't eat or drink anything. She just wakes up and cries. When she cries, she gets too tired and falls asleep and refuses to eat or drink anything." Tang and his wife were sitting and talking with Mr. Tam when suddenly Mrs. Tam, who was sleeping, sat up and shouted loudly, "Run away, my child, run away, oh my people, they killed my child, oh my people." Tang, who was holding a cup of water in his hand, was startled, and the cup of water in his hand fell straight to the floor. En Hung's eyes were bloodless. Mrs. Tam's scream sounded so pitiful that it made others shiver. Mr. Tam quickly ran to help her, grabbed her hand and said, "Wake up, Tang and his wife are back, they came to visit us, my wife." When Mr. Tam finished speaking, Mrs. Tam stopped crying. She turned her eyes to where Tang and En Hung were standing. Her eyes were hazy and her voice seemed emotional. Her voice was weak. "Tang is back, my child. Did you see Tin? Do you know where he is now?" Mrs. Tam's voice became more and more urgent, urging Tang to be confused and scared. Seeing that Mrs. Tam was scaring Tang, Mr. Tam quickly ran to remove her hand from Tang's body. He coaxed his wife. "You have to calm down. If you do that, they will be scared. Try to rest and get well. Then Tin and Hoa will come back like Tang and Hoa." En Hung stood outside and witnessed, her face still showing fear, but she tried to stammer to encourage Mrs. Tam. Yes, that's right. Tin and Hoa will probably come back soon. You try to rest and stay healthy. Don't think too much, or you will get sicker." Mrs. Tam seemed to listen to everyone and stopped screaming. Sitting on the bed with her hair disheveled, she started shaking her head again, and then she mumbled, "No, they won't come back, they're dead, it's terrible." Then she half cried and half laughed like a madman, continuously witnessing the unusual actions of Mrs. Tam and Tang. Her face changed color. Knowing that the two grandchildren were scared, Mr. Tam immediately said, "Let's go out to the table and drink some water. Leave her alone, sit and talk for a while. She'll get tired and go to sleep by herself." The three of them walked to the table together to drink water. Tang suddenly held Mr. Tam's hand and said, "Uncle, from the past until now, I have always considered you and your wife as my second parents. I also consider Tin as my younger sibling in the family. I will try my best to find information about Tin for you. If anything unfortunate happens, I would like to be your daughter so that we can take care of you." En Hung also came forward and held Mr. Tam's hand with a kind gesture. "Uncle, please consider us as your children. If you need anything, just call us. We are like your parents, so don't be shy. Let us take Tin's place to take care of you when she is away from home." Mr. Tam was very touched, his eyes shaking, thanking Tang and his wife. "Uncle, thank you for your kindness. Since the past until now, we have always considered you as Tin, as our own children. When you grow up, you are all obedient, filial, and understanding. That's a great blessing." Saying that, Mr. Tam took the boxes of cakes that Tang and En Hung brought as gifts and placed them on the altar to light incense. The incense sticks burned and smoked on the altar. Suddenly, Tang's eyes widened, and he looked straight at Mr. Tam's altar. Tang raised his hand to rub his eyes, and then breathed a sigh of relief. En Hung looked at Tang with a puzzled expression. Tang looked at En Hung and signaled to leave. The two stood up to ask Mr. Tam's permission and then left. Tang walked faster to quickly leave Mr. Tam's house because the things that happened at Mr. Tam's house were so creepy and spooky that it made people shiver. That afternoon, Tang spent a large sum of money to slaughter a buffalo and invite all the neighbors. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Tang's house was bustling with noise and excitement. Each person had a job to do. The sound of laughter and chatter was so loud that everyone could see how generous and rich Tang and his wife were. Tang and Hung were dressed very elegantly and walked around to check if the food was made as they had instructed. The young men brought the buffalo and tied it up and put it against some big tree trunks. The buffalo's eyes were wide open. Even though it was very strong, it couldn't struggle. The young men held big hammers, and then loud popping sounds rang out, a sweet poke. The knife was smashed into the buffalo's throat. The buffalo's eyes widened in pain. He pulled out the knife. Blood kept pouring from the buffalo's throat. The people around were still talking and pointing, witnessing the buffalo slowly dying from blood loss. At this time the buffalo's eyes were closed. It was no longer breathing. Thinking it was dead, everyone removed the ropes to start butchering it. Just as the ropes were removed, Hung came out, not understanding why the buffalo suddenly opened its eyes wide. Its eyes were red like blood clots. It jumped up and rushed straight to Hung too. Surprised, scared, Hung only had time to scream and stood still on the spot, popping several popping sounds. The golden pop. The buffalo fell right in front of Hung. The young men, after a moment of shock, rushed after and continuously used the hammer to hit the buffalo's head, causing its skull to crack open, revealing its brain. The buffalo's mouth was now full of blood. All of that terrifying event happened right in front of Hung. Hung was completely panicked. She could not stand still anymore and sat down on the ground, screaming loudly, "Help! Help! Help me! Blood! Blood! Blood!" Hung just kept screaming for help. Her eyes were panicked. She did not move but dragged her body on the ground and crawled towards the house. When the people saw that, they quickly ran to help Hung up. Tang was busy meeting some officials in the village, heard the noisy shouting outside the gate, and quickly ran out to see what was going on. When he got there and saw that scene, Tang also stopped. His eyes changed quickly, then ran to Hung. At this time, because Hung was too scared that she fainted, Tang took Hung inside the house to rest, then returned to the buffalo slaughterhouse to explain that Hung was allergic to her wife. Hearing this, everyone present understood why Hung was so scared. Tang turned to blame the people in charge of butchering the buffalo. "You are the most famous professional buffalo butchers in this area. How can the buffalo stand up and walk after being bled?" One of the middle-aged people spoke up. "We are also very sorry about what just happened, but in more than 10 years of working in this profession, this is the first time I have seen a buffalo that has stopped breathing after being bled and still be able to open its eyes and even stand up and walk. It is truly unimaginable." Tang did not say anything more. Tang was a bit bewildered, because the sight of the buffalo's head being smashed open haunted Tang. That day, at Mr. Tam's family's party, only Mr. Tam came to join in the fun with Tang's family. Mrs. Tam was still lying in bed crying and refusing to go anywhere. Seeing people return in joy and success, Mr. Tam's heart suddenly ached with tears as if they were about to fall. At the beginning of the party, Tang spoke a few words to thank the parents of the neighboring villagers who always loved and protected Tang and his wife so that Tang and his wife could be like today. Thanked the villagers during the days Tang and his wife were away for helping Tang's parents so that when Tang returned, he could still see his parents healthy and peaceful. Then Tang called Hung over and both went to Mr. Tam. In front of the entire village, Tang and Hung were extremely grateful to Mr. Tam and his wife for the years they had been with Tang's family. Tang and his wife asked permission to be adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Tam and would take care of them until Tin and his wife returned. Hearing that, the villagers all clapped their hands to praise Tang's couple's kindness. Mr. and Mrs. Tan and Lon were extremely satisfied because they saw their son and daughter-in-law living with foresight and kindness. They were also proud of their neighbors. Mr. Tam's eyes were filled with tears. He thanked Tang and his wife, then asked permission to leave to take care of Mrs. Tam, who was still sick at home. Hung quickly ran to help Mr. Tam out of the gate, her actions more caring than her own parents. Seeing Tang and his wife like that, everyone in the village praised Mr. and Mrs. Tan's family for being blessed with a son who was both filial and knew how to behave, had a kind heart, and had a daughter-in-law who was also beautiful and virtuous. Hung took Mr. Tam to his house and then said goodbye to him and went home. It was only about 8 o'clock in the evening, and it started to drizzle outside. Hung covered her head as she walked, so she suddenly remembered the scene from that afternoon. And Hung shivered and walked faster. When she started to turn into her house's gate, a cold wind suddenly blew, making In Hung shrink back. Rustle, rustle, there was a sound of something in the bamboo bushes right behind her. In Hung instinctively turned around to look, but there was nothing behind her, just a dark, gloomy, quiet space behind the old bamboo bushes. In Hung was about to turn around and go inside when suddenly something red was slowly coming out from the darkness. In Hung stood rooted to the spot. In the dark space behind the bamboo bush were two red eyes glowing like two glowing coals in the night. The red had a blood-red color. It walked out to the middle of the bamboo bush and stopped. It seemed to be looking at In Hung. Then suddenly from the bamboo bush came a cat's meow. The shock was so great that In Hung only had time to scream once before falling down in front of the gate. The squid was in the yard, and suddenly it also ran towards the sound of In Hung's scream. It howled loudly. Everyone was eating and drinking happily when they heard In Hung's scream. Seeing that, everyone there also stopped eating and ran out to see what was going on. When they got to the gate, they saw In Hung lying unconscious there. Next to it was the squid, which was standing right next to In Hung, but it completely ignored In Hung lying on the ground. Instead, its eyes were directed straight towards the bamboo bushes, barking loudly. Every now and then, it would scratch its feet on the ground, as if it wanted to run out of the gate and tear something out. Mr. and Mrs. Tan had also run out at this time. They called for Tang and everyone to quickly bring In Hung into the house. The squid was still waiting at the gate and barking. Mr. Tan shouted a few sentences before it ran inside, but every time it ran a short distance, it would turn back to look at the gate, but when it got into the yard, it would squat down, its eyes still looking at the gate. When they got home, In Hung woke up a while later, but her eyes were filled with extreme fear. Tang asked In Hung why she was so scared. In Hung recounted, but her voice was still trembling. I took Uncle Tam home. On the way home when I turned into the gate, suddenly a strong wind blew, making me freeze all over. Then suddenly there was a movement behind me. I turned around and saw a cat. Its eyes were red as blood, but I wasn't sure if it was a cat or what because I could only see its eyes, but the sound that followed was definitely a cat's. But that sound was terrifying, like a cat being stabbed alive. Tang's eyes were clearly filled with confusion, although he didn't know what happened, but in all the years they've been married, Tang had never seen In Hung faint. In Hung is also a healthy woman, but in just today, she fainted twice. The neighbors thought that it was the influence of the afternoon incident that made In Hung hallucinate. They had never seen a cat with red eyes before, and no one felt the strong wind that In Hung mentioned. Could it be that only In Hung had that wind? The neighbors sat around chatting and talking until the last person left, which was already past 10 o'clock at night. After everyone had left, Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lon called Tang and In Hung over and told Tang and his wife all the strange things they had witnessed in the past week. After listening, Tang and In Hung looked at each other, looking worried but not surprised. They did not expect that after so many years of returning to their homeland, so many strange things would happen. Tang suddenly stood up and said to Mr. and Mrs. Tan, I see that there are many unusual things to tell. Tomorrow I will go to the district, and then I will go find a teacher to see what is going on at our house or at Uncle Tam's house. Of course, no one objected to Tang's opinion. Everyone told each other to go to bed. Tomorrow Tang would have to go to town early. Seeing Mr. Tan not sleeping but going out to the yard, Tang called out, Dad, why are you still out there? Why are you not sleeping? Mr. Tan replied, Dad, go out and close the gate or the squid will run around. Okay, leave it there, I'll go out and close it. After saying that, Tang went out to the gate, was about to close the bamboo gate when suddenly, Tang felt like someone had just run past him. Tang muttered, Strange, it's clear that someone just passed by, why did he walk so fast? Thinking and hesitating for a moment, Tang pushed the gate open and walked out to the street. Looking around, there was absolutely no one. It was late at night, the mist was falling, making the scene here a bit gloomy and cold. Thinking about it made Tang's skin crawl. Suddenly there was a sound like someone threw something. Heard a thud. Tang turned back towards Mr. Tam's house. Tang stood still, eyes wide open, mouth speechless, unable to speak. In front of Tang at the gate of Mr. Tam's house, there were 4 red eyes like 2 blood vessels looking straight at Tang. Suddenly the squid, who didn't know when, ran out right in front of Tang, barked loudly at those 4 eyes, and the 4 eyes suddenly disappeared. Only then did Tang regain his senses. Tang turned around and quickly closed the bamboo gate and went straight into the house. The squid also trotted after him. Only then did Tang understand that it was true as his father said, the squid was very smart, and that every time it barked, something unusual was definitely happening. Tang patted the squid's head and went into the house. Seeing Tang taking a long time, and Hung asked, "I went to close the gate. What were you doing out there? Why did it take so long?" Tang answered vaguely, not wanting In Hung to be more scared, so Tang didn't mention what had just happened. The next morning, Tang woke up early and cycled straight to the district. Now wherever people in the village go, they talk about Tang and his wife, who are both rich and virtuous, living with affection, especially accepting Mr. and Mrs. Tam as their adoptive parents until Mr. Tam's son Tin returned. Tang emerged as a person who was both rich and virtuous, but people did not understand why Tang did not bother to build a house but still lived in Mr. and Mrs. Tan's old house. Many people asked Tang why he did not build one, but Tang just said, "This house is my whole memory. I want to live with it for a few more years, and when it is completely broken, I will consider building a new one." When he went to the district, Tang asked around, and was finally directed to the house of a famous fortune teller in the area. The fortune teller received Tang, but she put on her hat and lowered her head, and only spoke to Tang in a gloomy voice. Then she suddenly said, "You came to me to see if your house had been having unusual phenomena lately, like being haunted, right?" Tang was startled because even though he had not yet said his intention, the teacher had already told him the reason why he was here. Before Tang could say anything more, the teacher said, "I can help you, but the amount of money is not small. If you agree, we will continue talking. If not, you can stand up and go home." In fact, the price that the teacher offered was very high compared to many people, but compared to Tang at this time, it was only a very small number. Without thinking, Tang immediately replied, "Money is not a problem, but can you do it?" The teacher slightly curled her lips into a mysterious smile and said, "If you can't, then come here and take my head. I will guarantee it with my life, but there is one thing I need you to do for me." Tang hurriedly asked again, "What is it, teacher? Just tell me I can do it." The teacher said to Tang, "On your land, there is a small shrine. Under that shrine there is a porcelain jar. It is the reason that attracts demons to haunt your house. You must take that jar and bring it back here for me. Replace it with my jar. Remember that everything must be kept secret and no one in your family must know, okay? If anyone else sees it, it will be considered a failure and no one will be able to help your family anymore. When you finish what I told you to do, come back here as soon as possible." Saying that, she went inside to get Tang a porcelain vase and gave it to Tang. Tang took it, put it in his backpack and cycled back. Behind her, the teacher slowly took off her hat, her long hair reaching her heels. Her eyes without pupils were as white as rice water. She smiled slightly, a ghostly smile. That night Tang did exactly as the witch told him. When he broke the porcelain vase, he felt a cold wind running down his spine. Shivering, Tang filled everything back up and returned to his bedroom. Everything went smoothly without anyone knowing. The next day Tang brought the money and the vase he dug up from the foot of the temple to the witch. She received the vase and laughed crazily. She gave Tang 2 amulets and told Tang to do exactly as she said. From now on, no ghosts or demons would be able to bother Tang's family anymore. Tang thanked the witch and left. A few days later, Mrs. Tam's condition seemed to get worse. Tang and In Hung came to visit again. After several days of not eating or drinking anything, but only crying and wailing, Mrs. Tam probably wouldn't be able to hold on much longer if this continued. Mr. Tam was helpless with a sad look in his eyes. In Hung went to the bed where Mrs. Tam was lying and asked her kindly, but asking was just asking. Now Mrs. Tam didn't care about anything anyone asked or said. She just lay there and whispered her son's name. Mr. Tam told Tang to sit down, and he went down to the kitchen to boil some tea. Mr. Tam went out the door, and Tang also stood up and brought the box of cakes and fruits to the altar for Mr. Tam to burn incense. Tang was struggling on the altar when suddenly someone stood behind him, making him startled and turn around. Tang hugged his chest and said to Mr. Tam, "You scared me. I thought you were boiling water to make tea in the kitchen." Mr. Tam answered Tang with tired eyes, "You're old and confused. You forgot the teapot, so you came back to get it. And I can burn incense too. I'm like a child in the house, no problem." Tang happily replied, "Yes, then I'll burn incense and pray for you to get well soon and for Tin and his wife to be safe, uncle." Mr. Tam nodded slightly, and then took the kettle and went down to the kitchen. Tang took out the incense and lit it, but for some reason it didn't burn. After a while, the incense started to burn, but when Tang just put it in the incense bowl, the incense burst into flames, making Tang jump back in surprise. After that moment, the incense sticks burned normally again. Tang returned to his seat, his face still not over the fear. And Hung also witnessed the incident. The couple looked at each other with eyes showing fear. Mrs. Tam suddenly grabbed In Hung's hand and said, "My children, where are you two going? Come back to me. Why are you running away? Come back to me, my children." And Hung was a little scared. She removed Mrs. Tam's hand and walked to where Tang was sitting at the table. And Hung looked up at the altar where the incense sticks were still burning steadily, as if nothing had happened. Mr. Tam hurriedly carried the teapot from the kitchen to the door and saw Tang and his wife coming out. Tang quickly said, "I was going to stay and play with you a little longer, but I suddenly remembered that I have some important matters at home that need to be resolved, so I can come over and play with you tomorrow." Tang and his wife left, but Tang did not know that the incense sticks on Mr. Tam's altar had gone out. After a while, it had been more than a month since Tang and his wife returned after asking for the shaman's charm, and the strange events had stopped happening. In Hung announced that she was pregnant. Tang was extremely happy. Mr. and Mrs. Tan were so happy that everything was perfect for them. They immediately urged Tang, "My wife is pregnant, and tomorrow she will give birth to a grandchild. She and her child cannot live in such a dilapidated house. If people do not have the means, then that's fine. It is not difficult to build a house for her, so we should build a decent house for her. If she is pregnant and it is dilapidated, it is not good for her. If she gets sick, the child in her womb will also be affected." And Hung also whined and wanted Tang to build a new house soon. Tang pondered for a moment and then promised to build it before the child was born. Everyone was smiling happily, their faces bright. Only Tang did not smile, not because Tang regretted the money to build the house, but because Tang was thinking about something else. Today Tang and In Hung went to visit Mr. and Mrs. Tam again. Mr. Tam was also much weaker, his face had many more wrinkles, his eyes were dark from lack of sleep taking care of his wife. Mrs. Tam was still the same, lying still softly calling her son's name. Mr. Tam told Tan. Before, she dreamed of Tin and Hoa every day, but for a long time she has not dreamed of them anymore. She is even more miserable, not knowing how much longer she can live, but it is so miserable, not knowing how they are alive or dead. Now, saying that, Mr. Tam raised his hand to wipe away the tears that were about to fall. Tang looked towards Mrs. Tam's bed and looked at In Hung. Then In Hung nodded. Tang slowly said to Mr. Tam, "Uncle Tam, I have something to tell you, but you have to be calm and listen to me." Mr. Tam continued, "What's so important? Just tell me." Tang seemed confused and said, "Yes, it's about Tin and his wife." Mr. Tam hurriedly said, "Tin, have you heard from them? Where are they? When will they come back?" Tang's eyes showed sadness and pain. "Yes, Tin and Hoa are both dead. They died right when he was being chased by the police. I sent someone to investigate, and they went to the border and were buried by landslides and rocks. The people in the village up there dug up their graves and buried them in the forest. They only kept this bracelet, and I immediately recognized it as the bracelet that Tam was still wearing." Mr. Tam couldn't believe his ears and stammered back at Tang. Are you sure? Are they all dead?" Tang replied sadly, "I hope you'll stop being sad, but I verified very carefully before coming to tell you." Saying that, Tang gave Mr. Tam the bracelet that his grandparents had given Hoa on their wedding day. His hands were shaking, his knees buckled. Since Mrs. Tam's dream, he had been mentally prepared for this day, but when he heard it with his own ears, he was still shocked. On Mrs. Tam's bed, after hearing the whole story, she sat up and looked at Mr. Tam's hand holding the bracelet. She only said 2 words, "My child," and then fainted. After that shocking news, 2 days later, Mrs. Tam passed away. Perhaps she tried to use her last breath to wait for her children to come home, but when she knew for sure that her 2 children had died, she gave up. Mr. Tam was also completely devastated. In Mr. Tam's house, the altar now had both Tin and Hoa's names. The house became cold, gloomy, and mournful. Mr. and Mrs. Tan and Lon still ran back and forth every day, taking turns taking care of Mr. Tam. The neighbors also felt sorry for Mr. Tam's family situation. They had just learned that their son and daughter-in-law had died a long time ago, but they had also lost their wives. On the day of Mr. Tam's wife's funeral, thunder suddenly struck the sky. The wind blew loudly, making the candles on Mrs. Tam's coffin sway. It started to rain heavily, the rain even splashed into the house. Suddenly, all the oil lamps went out, but the candles were all gone. The whole house was pitch black, leaving only a few red dots of incense sticks. Everyone was in a panic. Everyone felt the atmosphere was a bit creepy, so even though it was raining heavily, some neighbors ignored it and ran home not daring to stay. Mr. Tan's family of 4 were sitting around Mrs. Tam's coffin. At this time, Tang and his wife held each other's hands tightly, their eyes darting around. Suddenly, another thunderclap lit up the sky. Everyone was scared out of their wits, and the space suddenly became quiet again. At this time, the sound of the squid in Mr. Tan's alley started to howl horribly in Mr. Tam's house. Everyone there could hear it clearly. Suddenly, a neighbor whispered, "How horrible! Why is Mr. Tan's dog howling like a dog biting a ghost?" After saying that, the neighbor covered her mouth with her hand. That sentence unintentionally made everyone scared and huddle closer together. Outside, the occasional lightning flashes made the atmosphere in the house even more spooky. In the flickering lightning, Tang suddenly unintentionally looked towards Mr. Tam's gate. Tang's mouth stuttered, his hands and feet trembling. He grabbed In Hung's hand and pointed. At who's standing at the gate? Outside the gate, 2 white shadows were walking back and forth, as if they wanted to go in but couldn't. Many people didn't dare to look, but some people were brave enough to look, but there was nothing standing there. Nothing unusual. Tang was still open-mouthed, and his face was pale. In Hung had to shake Tang several times before he came back to his senses. In Hung asked Tang, "What are you pointing at?" "There's nothing out there." Tang turned around to look again, and everything was back to normal. There was no white shadow. At this time, the lights and candles in the house were also lit again. The sound of the squid in Mr. Tan's house had also stopped. The atmosphere returned to normal. Suddenly the candle on top of Mrs. Tam's coffin fell, and hit In Hung, who was sitting, burning a corner of the mourning dress In Hung was wearing. Tang quickly put out the fire and put the candle back in the coffin. In Hung felt a little uneasy. In Hung suddenly looked at Mrs. Tam's portrait. In the photo, Mrs. Tam seemed to smile at In Hung. Because Mr. and Mrs. Tam had no relatives, Mr. Tan's family stayed at the funeral all night. In Hung and Tang were no exception. Both did not dare to sleep, but stayed up talking with a few kind neighbors who stayed to help. The atmosphere was also less cold. The next morning it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. Everyone at Mr. Tam's funeral had already gotten up to prepare for the ceremony to take Mrs. Tam to the field, when the neighbors' voices were heard as they walked and shouted, "Oh my God, it's so horrible. I don't know who was so cruel, Mr. Tan. Go home and see. Your dog was beaten to death by some bad guy last night at your gate." Hearing what the neighbor said, Mr. Tan immediately ran out to the alley. Tang and In Hung also followed right behind their father. When they got to the alley, Mr. Tan stood there looking at the dog with a pained expression, because it had been with them for 10 years. It was very smart, and to him it was no different from a friend. Tang and In Hung stood rooted to the spot, their eyes filled with horror. After a moment of horror, Tang spoke loudly in anger. Who the hell was so cruel? What crime did the dog commit that they killed it so brutally? It was truly inhuman. In Hung glanced at Tang, then fearfully looked away. The squid had been hit by something, its skull broken, both eyes bulging out, blood flowing all over the road. Even though it had rained heavily last night, blood was still splattered all over the road this morning. The scene was extremely terrifying and disgusting. Mrs. Tam's funeral ended smoothly that afternoon without any incident. Tang and In Hung were exhausted after helping out and went home. Both of them went straight to bed to sleep. Suddenly remembering what happened last night, In Hung asked Tang again. After listening to Tang's story, In Hung also told Tang what she saw. There was no need to sleep anymore. After listening to In Hung's story, Tang knew for sure that he was not mistaken, so he immediately took his bike straight to the shaman's house that day. After his wife's funeral, Mr. Tam became less talkative. He was alone and didn't even go to Mr. Tan's house to play like usual. He wandered around like a ghost, just trying to get through the days and months. Every day, he cleaned the altar where his wife, son, and daughter-in-law's tablets were, and tears streamed down his face. Time passed. Today was also the 49th day since Mrs. Tam passed away. Early in the morning, Mr. and Mrs. Tan had not yet woken up. Tang went to Mr. Tam's house. Today was the 49th day of Mrs. Tam's funeral, so he went early to see if there was anything he could do to help. But after a while, Tang ran home and shouted, "Mom and Dad! Mom and Dad!" Uncle Tam fell and hit his head on a rock in the yard. "Dead, dead!" Hearing his son say that Mr. Tan was washing his face outside the water jar, he quickly ran over with Mrs. Lan and In Hung. Tang ran to the outside neighborhood to call more villagers. Mr. Tam lay collapsed in a pool of blood right in front of the main door. In front of Mr. Tam's house, there was a large, square green stone that he had carried back to make a place to sit and enjoy the cool breeze. It was not raining, and the yard was dry. Although Mr. Tam was sad and exhausted, his limbs were still very flexible. I don't know how he fell and died so tragically. Mr. Tan and Lon cried until their eyes were swollen, and Hung beside them also cried. Tang ran around to arrange people and buy things to hold Mr. Tam's funeral. Mr. Tam's funeral was organized by Tang's family very thoughtfully. The day he was brought to his final resting place, it rained heavily and thundered loudly. The villagers and neighbors felt sorry for Mr. and Mrs. Tam, who lived a good and honest life, but had a cruel fate. Some women whispered to each other. It was really hard for the two of them. Their children went to work far away and died. They didn't even get to see their child's body. When they died, it rained heavily and the coffin was flooded. It was truly pitiful. Some other people added, luckily Mr. Tan's family and Tang's couple were kind. Otherwise who knows what would have happened. Each person had a comment. Everyone felt sorry for Mr. Tam and his wife, but also praised Tang and his wife for being kind. So from then on that land, only Mr. and Mrs. Tan's family remained. Less than 2 months after Mr. Tam passed away, people saw a big house rising up in the middle of the land. Because Mr. Tam's family had no one left, Tang's family was the only relative. Even the neighbors knew that Tang had accepted Mr. Tam as his adoptive father for a long time, so no one talked about Tang building a house on Mr. Tam's land. The 5-room tiled house was set back. In front of the house was the business area of Tang and his wife. At that time, the government also started to build a road across Tang's house, even moving all the clinics and markets to the opposite side of Tang's house. Tang's house's location suddenly became prime, and the land price skyrocketed. Tang was now rich, and even richer. In Hung was also 8 months pregnant. After going to the doctor, he said she would give birth to a son, so Tang was very happy. Mr. and Mrs. Tan were also enjoying their old age, just waiting for their grandson to be born to be complete. Tang's life now is full of material things, happy and joyful. This is probably also the most beautiful time in Tang and his wife's life. A few months later, In Hung gave birth to Mr. and Mrs. Tan, a healthy, chubby baby boy. Tang named him Fu. The more joy there was, the more laughter filled Mr. and Mrs. Tan's family. Time passed by. 3 years after Fu's birth, In Hung gave birth to another very pretty baby girl. With the wish that their children would always live in wealth, Tang named her Kui. Mr. and Mrs. Tan seemed to be getting younger and healthier because their family was warm, happy, and full of children. Time passed peacefully, and in a flash, 10 years had passed. Fu was 13 years old, smart, studious, and obedient. Kui was in 5th grade, pretty, obedient, and diligent. Tang and his wife were very happy because their 2 children were studious and obedient. Tang's house was now a stopover for many visitors passing by to stop and rest. The income was quite good. Tang and his wife had to hire 6 or 7 more housekeepers, but Tang and his wife still had to be busy. In their free time, Fu and Kui also went out to the store to help their parents. Mr. Tan and Mrs. Lan were free, so they cooked 3 meals a day together. Sometimes they also went out to the restaurant to help their children and grandchildren. Mr. Tan really liked raising black dogs. He said that the black dog breed was always smarter and more intelligent than other breeds of dogs. When the black dog died for a while, Mr. Tan immediately went to buy another black dog. It had been several years, and it was quite smart and bigger than the previous black dog. On a Sunday morning, everyone in the house had already woken up to get ready for work. Tang and In Hung quickly rushed out to the restaurant. Mr. Tan had also been there for a while. He often went to exercise in the morning, and then returned to the restaurant to look after Tang and In Hung. At home, Fu and Kui had the day off as usual. They ran to where Mrs. Lan was sleeping and whined, asking her to tell them a story. However, today they kept calling but she didn't move. Her eyes were still closed. Fu knew something was wrong, so he ran straight to the restaurant to inform his grandfather and parents. Tang and In Hung immediately ran back into the house towards Mrs. Lan's room. Mr. Tan was startled and ran after them, then he fell. Fu, who was standing next to him, caught them and the 2 of them quickly walked inside. Tang and In Hung arrived, saw little Kui still shaking her grandmother's hand. Tang quickly told and Hung to pull the little girl away, and then went to hold Mrs. Land's arm. Tang was startled and quickly let go of her hand. Her hand was cold and stiff. She had died without anyone knowing. Mrs. Land's death was extremely unexpected. No one thought she would pass away so quickly. At the age of over 60, she was still very healthy and clear-headed. Just yesterday, she was still going to the shop to help Tang and his wife. Her face was rosy and happy. Tang put his head down on the bed and cried, his mouth screaming, "Mom, why did you leave me? Leave my grandchild without saying goodbye like this, Mom." At that time, Mr. Tan and Fu also entered the place and heard Tang's cry. He knew that the worst had happened to his wife. He held his chest with one hand. He was so shocked by this unexpected pain. He trembled and approached. He could not control himself anymore. He put his head on Mrs. Land's forehead. He shook her and woke her up, but it was too late. He cried and blamed himself for not taking good care of her. Seeing that scene, Fu and Kui, the two grandchildren, also understood that their grandmother had passed away forever. They wanted to go in with their grandmother, but their mother did not let them. The two children could only stand outside and cry, calling for their grandmother. Their cries made the whole neighborhood noisy. It had been a long time since they had been so sad after such happy days in this land. The neighbors heard the news of Mrs. Land's death and whispered to each other, "How pitiful, Mrs. Lan had lived such a virtuous life, but how could God have the heart to take her away so soon?" Just yesterday, I saw her going to the market with her two grandchildren. They were still laughing happily, but after last night, she passed away without a single last word. Another woman immediately said, "Last time, Mr. Tam also died unexpectedly, passed away without a last word. Now it's Mrs. Land's turn. This land has been unlucky since ancient times. No one dared to live anywhere, but their two families dared to live there. It's too much." Mrs. Land's funeral took place right after that morning, when everyone told each other to go by a coffin, not knowing if there was a mistake. But after someone brought the coffin, while they were chanting to put Mrs. Land's body in the coffin, a man brought another coffin. He said that a couple came to put it and said they were returning to this address. Everyone turned pale. It was an inauspicious sign. One person died and two coffins appeared. It was a sign that someone else in the house was about to follow the dead person. Tang was very angry, but did not know who bought this coffin. To avoid trouble, Tang quickly gave the delivery man some money and asked him to take the coffin home. The villagers who witnessed the incident kept whispering to each other about the appearance of two coffins. Everyone felt something creepy. Their whole body had goosebumps. Mrs. Land's funeral went smoothly except for that incident. After that day, Tang went to the coffin shop, but the shop owner said that he did not let anyone else take the coffin. There was no way there was a mistake because in the past few days he had only sold one to Tang's family, not to anyone else. Tang was at a loss to understand what was happening, because that morning it was Tang and Hung who went to order the coffin together, so how could there be such a coincidence? After thinking for a long time, but could not find an answer, Tang guessed that it was probably the shop owner who made a mistake, but was afraid of being scolded by him, so he did not dare to admit it. Thinking so, Tang did not bother to find out anymore. 3 days after Mrs. Land's death, the terrible thing happened to Tang's family again. Here, people have a custom when burying them. They only cover the grave with soil. On the 3rd day after the burial, the relatives of the deceased came out and covered the grave. It was around 11 o'clock in the morning after Mr. Tan and his children and grandchildren went out to the cemetery to cover Mrs. Land's grave. When they finished on the way home, Mr. Tan suddenly stopped and turned back to Mrs. Land's grave. He stammered, Why is that? She is." Tang heard Mr. Tan say that and immediately asked, "Dad, what are you looking at that you talk so strangely?" Mr. Tan did not answer Tang. He continued to go home. On the way, he muttered to himself. Tang walked next to his father, trying to listen but could not hear anything. His face showed worry and confusion. Arriving at the gate, before he could even step into the house, Mr. Tan suddenly gasped for breath, holding his chest, and then he fell to the street. Everyone was shocked and gathered around to help him up. He whispered, looking towards Tang and his wife, and said, Go away from here quickly, don't stay." Speaking up to hear, his eyes glanced at his two grandchildren, and before he breathed his last, he could only say one sentence. "Poor children." Then from his mouth flowed a stream of red blood. He had died, but his eyes were still wide open. He died with his eyes open. The people of Thuong village had another chance to gossip about Mr. Tan and his wife. The two of them were healthy and suddenly died of unknown causes. Within 3 days, an atmosphere of mourning enveloped the large house. It was already large after the consecutive deaths of Mr. Tan and his wife. It became even more deserted and gloomy. Tang and Hung looked at each other in pain. Hung sat silently, her head bowed, sobbing in front of Mr. Tan's coffin, while Tang sobbed and sobbed, losing both his father and mother in just 3 short days. Tang seemed to have tasted the ultimate pain. The family was going through happy days when a huge storm came and swept everything away. After Mr. Tan's somewhat horrifying death, the villagers began to whisper and spread horror stories. Some women kept peeping outside the gate to look into the funeral. Not daring to enter and gossiping, someone said, "This land is haunted. In the past no one dared to live there. Yet Mr. Tam and Mr. Tang's family came here to live for so many years. It is said that Mr. Tam was a shaman or something. When he came here he himself did not set up an altar in the middle of that land. They must have done something so that the ghost did not destroy them. Now it may have lost its effect, and the ghost took revenge." Another woman chimed in, "I also heard many people say that whoever dares to stay here will be harmed by the ghost, without sparing anyone. It's very scary, ladies." Some people said that Mr. Tan's death was due to violating a taboo, that on the day Mrs. Lan died, she bought 2 coffins. Everyone had their own opinion, but everyone understood that deaths in this land were somewhat creepy and unusual. The women looked at each other in fear, their eyes darting inward, then without saying a word, they went straight home. That day at Mr. Tan's funeral, it was not raining but gloomy. The thunder was still rumbling in the sky. The atmosphere around the house was extremely gloomy and cold. Inside the house, Tang and his wife still stood with their hands clasped in front of Mr. Tan's coffin to thank those who came to pay their respects. Inside, Fu and Kui sat next to Mr. Tan's coffin. The 2 of them cried until their eyes were swollen, too. No matter how anyone tried to chase her away, refused to leave, just clinging to Mr. Tan's coffin, seeing that everyone couldn't bear to chase her away anymore. In the middle of the night outside was still strangely gloomy and quiet. Suddenly a thunderclap struck the sky, making everyone's heart skip a beat. At this time outside the house only a few workers for Tang's family were still there. At Mrs. Lan's funeral, some kind neighbors were still there, but at Mr. Tan's funeral people had guessed that something scary was happening to this house, so they just lit incense, asked questions quickly, and then went straight home. Tang was still sitting in front of his father's coffin, his eyes filled with pain and despair. Hung fell asleep right there. Hearing the thunder, everyone woke up and was bewildered. Suddenly, Tu, who was in the house, ran straight to the gate, wagging his tail and barking as if he was very happy. When he got to the gate, he just stood there wagging his tail. The people who witnessed the incident were all scared out of their wits. They sat close together, but no one saw anything. However, 2 people saw an extremely terrifying scene. That was Tang and Hung. They both saw 2 white figures standing outside the gate, looking into the house through the gate. Tu kept wagging his tail happily. After a while, the 2 white figures disappeared. Tu also stopped wagging his tail. He sadly ran back to where Mr. Tan's coffin was lying prostrate as before. Tang and Hung knew that it was their parents coming back, but why were they outside the gate and not going into the house? Tang turned to look at Hung's face and asked, "You saw it too, right?" Hung nodded slightly. Both of them looked at each other worriedly. Then, without saying anything, each of them was lost in their own thoughts. The next day, Mr. Tan's funeral went smoothly until after Mr. Tan was buried. Then something unusual happened. After Fu took Mr. Tan to the cemetery to bury him, on the way back, he kept smiling to himself. Seeing that, Hung approached and patted her on the shoulder and said, "Your grandfather just passed away. Why are you smiling like that?" He still smiled brightly and turned to his mother and said, "Last night I dreamed that my grandparents were with some other people. Then a girl whose face I couldn't see clearly asked me if I wanted to go out with them, and said that if I saw her, she told me to wait patiently, and then she would let me and Kui go see them." Hearing her son say that, Hung was startled, her face turned pale, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Hung stammered and asked again, So, did my grandparents say anything to me?" Fu answered with a face that didn't seem very happy. "I didn't see my grandparents say anything to me. When the girl asked me if I wanted to go out with them, they just looked at me and shook their heads." At this point, Hung couldn't keep her composure anymore, panicked and scared, trying to keep a little calm in front of her son. Hung turned to Fu and said, "Mom knows you love your grandparents so much that you're daydreaming like that. You can't tell this nonsense, people will laugh at you. especially your younger brother, he'll be scared. When they got home, En Hung pulled Tang straight into the room and told him about everything that had just happened. Tang sat silently, his eyes seemed quite tired. He said, "Calm down." After 3 days of losing both his grandparents, he was so shocked that he had hallucinations and daydreams. En Hung grabbed Tang's hand and pleaded, "I don't think this is normal. Go to the city to find a teacher to see what's going on. Ask him to help you. With my mother's instincts, I can feel that something is wrong with Fu. Besides, and last night, Dad and Mom came back, both you and I saw it." Thinking back to last night, Tang immediately replied, "Okay, let me take care of Dad for 3 days, and then I'll go to the district to find the teacher and ask." En Hung felt a little more reassured when her husband said that. En Hung also trusted this teacher a lot because the couple had asked him several times, and the results were very satisfactory. But not even 3 days after Mr. Tan's death, the next day, another horrifying incident caused a stir in the whole area. Everyone was shocked and sad. No one understood what was happening to Tang's family. That morning, Fu and Kui, two brothers, were riding their bicycles on their way home from school. On the way, they encountered a car that lost control and crashed straight into the car that Fu and Kui were riding. As a result, both children died on the spot. Their bodies were not intact. Receiving news of their two children's accident was like a thunderbolt. People did not even let En Hung go to the scene, fearing that she would be in too much pain and could not bear the great shock. Only Tang went out. When he got there, Tang could no longer stay calm. His legs gave out and he crawled step by step to his son, then crawled to his daughter, hugging her and crying in pain. His voice was a heart-wrenching scream, making everyone who witnessed it shed tears. A family that was happy, prosperous, and peaceful. Now only a week has passed away, for people have died, all of them tragically. Unexpectedly, without a last word, the surrounding villagers are scared. Many people do not dare to approach Tang's family's house. The rumors about the haunted land are now mentioned everywhere with fearful eyes. After many years, it was thought that the haunted land had been forgotten, but today everything is even more terrible than before. It was just the ghost of a girl in a white shirt combing her hair in the middle of a vacant lot. Now they have witnessed with their own eyes the tragic deaths, the consecutive deaths of people who were living on the haunted land in the past, extremely tragic and horrifying deaths. People are starting to be afraid when going home at night by Tang's house, now only. At dusk, children absolutely do not dare to pass by, and only the bravest adults dare to pass by. The rest choose to go the other way to avoid bad luck. The funeral of the two children was not held at home because according to the people here, if they died on the road, they would not be brought home, but would be held in the cemetery. The whole cemetery was covered with silk ribbons and white wreaths. The sound of trumpets and drums echoed as two coffins were placed next to each other above the billowing incense smoke. The two good and obedient children, who were once role models for many children in the village, were now preparing to lie forever in the cold ground. Although the villagers were scared and haunted, because of the neighborly affection and the family's relationship with the village, everyone still came out to help. En Hung and Tang were no longer conscious. Tang was dazed and kneeling before the coffins of his two children. En Hung kept fainting, screaming and calling to heaven. It seemed that after so many events, her tears had run out. Her hands were scratching at the coffins of her two children, and all 10 of En Hung's fingers were bleeding. Seeing the scene of a mother in despair when she lost 2 of her own children at the same time, everyone in the village who witnessed it couldn't help but feel sorry. Many people also cried. It was so tragic. They still asked why God was so cruel to their family. When it was time to lower the coffin, everyone told each other to pull En Hung out. En Hung tried her best to crawl and scratch, wanting to run away to die with her 2 children. Suddenly, En Hung stopped and looked up. In front of En Hung was a woman wearing a brown outfit that was a bit dirty and covered in mud. She was holding a child in her arms. En Hung saw that the outfit looked very familiar and looked up. En Hung was startled because it was actually someone she knew, very familiar. En Hung opened her eyes wide and looked at that person, stammering, Why are you here?" The woman bent down close to En Hung's face and then leaned close to her ear and said, "Long time no see, do you miss me? I brought my child to visit you, En Hung." At this point, En Hung could no longer keep calm. En Hung stood up, her eyes bulging, looking straight at the woman and shouting, it was you who did it, right?" The woman stood up without saying anything, her eyes red as blood, looking at the child she was holding in her arms. The child suddenly turned to look at En Hung. Its eyes were also red, Suddenly it burst out laughing, making In Hung extremely panicked. She lowered her head, her hands clenched and trembling. The woman said nothing and silently walked out of the cemetery. In Hung immediately ran after her. While running she screamed, "Give me back my child, give it back here." The people didn't understand who In Hung was talking about. She screamed and scratched at the empty space where no one was there. The villagers thought that because In Hung was so sad that she was psychologically traumatized and no longer normal. After burying the two children, Tang turned to In Hung. In Hung's eyes were lifeless at that time, absent-mindedly looking somewhere. Seeing Tang coming, In Hung rushed over and spoke hurriedly, her eyes bulging fiercely, grabbing Tang's arm. It's him, he's here." Tang heard everything In Hung said, but he did not react at all. He stood silently, his eyes lifeless. In front of him, In Hung continued to point and shout, Mother and child, it's mother and child, kill it, brother, kill it, don't let it harm our child, kill it." The woman holding the child in her arms stood outside the cemetery gate. For men with red eyes stood there staring at In Hung, then disappeared into nothingness. At this moment, everyone only knew that In Hung was in so much pain. The pain was too much for a human to bear, so she had gone crazy. In Hung kept half laughing and half crying, her hands always pointing forward, her mouth screaming as if she wanted to kill someone. Then she laughed again, then cried again, then went to look for her child. No one could recognize that just a week ago, this family was the dream of so many people. They were rich, they were happy. But in the blink of an eye, they lost everything. It was also the third evening after the death of the two children. Tang and In Hung now lived like ghosts. Most of the villagers no longer dared to go to Tang's house. Some familiar neighbors sometimes tried to suppress their fear and stopped by to see if Tang and his wife needed any help. However, after a few visits, Tang did not pay any attention to anyone but just lay in his room, locking the door and not answering when called. Outside the house, In Hung lay in front of the altar of her four relatives, half crying and half laughing. At one point, In Hung looked straight at a neighbor, rolled her eyes, and shouted loudly, "You killed my child, you destroyed my family. I'll kill you, I'll kill you." Then In Hung rushed to grab the neighbor's hair and pulled it repeatedly. The neighbor was so scared that she fainted. Several people who were with her rushed to free In Hung. When they finally freed In Hung from the neighbor, In Hung burst into tears and looked up at the altar, calling her child's name. After that, no one dared to go to that house again. A few days passed after the death of the two children. That night, In Hung was still lying madly on the porch in front of the middle room, where the altar for her parents and two children was placed. Suddenly, a cold air blew in, making In Hung's back shiver. In Hung suddenly turned around. In Hung was terrified, but at this time she had no strength to scream anymore. In front of In Hung was the shadow of a girl with long hair reaching her heels, wearing white clothes. Her eyes were white and opaque, her face was facing her. Behind her, there were many white shadows floating in the air. The white shadows suddenly smiled and disappeared. Tang was still lying still in the room. His eyes had gradually dimmed and turned white. The last tears rolled slowly down his cheeks. He began to remember old stories, stories that he never wanted to think about again, even once. Back to the day Tang and In Hung overheard the story of the fat guy in the district about the location of an area deep in the mountains where gold could be mined. The couple decided to go together. That day, Tang told Tin that he intended to go far away to work and wanted to invite Tin to go with him. But because he was afraid of being exposed, Tang did not tell Tin clearly about the incident. But Tin did not want to take risks and wanted to stay close to home to take care of her parents. Besides, working for the fat guy at that time also earned enough to support the family, and Tin decided not to go. Tin asked for Hoa to work near Tin's workplace, but Hoa had not been able to go to work for half a day when Tin's workplace was raided by the authorities. Because the fat guy's structure was out of date, the fat guy was also tied up and taken away. Tin was lucky that she was going out to buy breakfast when she returned and saw the fat guy being arrested. She knew something was up and she could not stay in this district town. If she went back to her hometown, she would also be arrested, so Tin quickly hid in a corner and waited for the authorities to leave. Tin immediately ran to Hoa's workplace. When she arrived, Tin ran straight to Hoa was wiping the table and said something. A moment later Hoa hurriedly took her bag and walked out of the shop, looking around and looking very scared. Then Tin and her husband led each other straight out of the district town towards the address Tang had written down on paper for Tin in case someone knew the address and could come looking for them. Luckily, Tin and her husband left more than a day later than Tang and his wife, But the next day the four of them met again at the ferry dock, because the day before the river water rose so high and the water flowed so fast that it was impossible to carry passengers across the ferry, so everyone had to sit on the bank and wait for the ferry to cross, so they could meet each other. Seeing Tin, Tang was very happy. After asking, they found out why Tin had to run after Tang. Tang was really happy, but In Hung was not. She tried to act happy, but in fact In Hung did not want anyone else to join the trip other than her and her husband. But Tang wanted them to go with her, and she did not dare to stop him, because In Hung also knew that Tang considered Tin as a real brother in the family. So the four of them started the journey to the location recorded by Tang on paper to find gold. Expected to only go within a year then return, but after a whole year of searching they still could not find it. Money was exhausted. The four people discussed with each other, determined not to return home, but to search until they found gold. So they built a house in the mountains, every day eating wild vegetables and wild fruits. After a long time they also went into the village of the ethnic people to bring wild animals to exchange for rice. The life of the four people was difficult and hard, but always happy and full of laughter. Gradually they got used to life here. 2 women went to pick wild vegetables every day, went to the stream to catch crabs and fish. 2 men took advantage of catching wild animals and digging holes to find gold, and they also decided not to have children because they wanted their children to have a happy life when they were born. So they wanted to have children. After they returned successfully. In the end, God did not disappoint them. In the 10th year they were on the mountain. Who knows how many caves were dug and how much sweat and tears the four of them shed. They found a place with gold. Not only was there gold, but there was a lot of it. Everyone hugged each other happily, tears of happiness falling. That amount of gold was enough for 2 families to live a comfortable life and no longer be poor. However, when the immediate benefit was too great, people easily became greedy. If only one person owned that amount of gold, it would be a huge fortune that many people, even the rich, would never dare to think about. In Hung was reluctant from the beginning when Tin and his wife followed. After living together for 10 years with close feelings, In Hung no longer felt jealous of Tin and his wife. But after the gold was found, In Hung suddenly felt annoyed when she saw Hoa holding each piece of gold to admire. Then Hoa discussed the future of building a house and buying a car with Tin right in front of In Hung, making In Hung feel irritated. But being a clever person who always knew how to live a fake life, In Hung still smiled and did not show any signs for Tin and his wife to recognize. The next morning, the 2 families divided the gold into 2 backpacks to start the journey back to their homeland with so much hope. Before preparing to return, Tin told Tang and his wife to stay and wait for Tin to go out and dig some wild ginseng to bring back as gifts. Hoa also ran after Tin, leaving In Hung and Tang with 2 backpacks with the gold that had been divided in half. In Hung grumbled at Tang for bringing Tin and his wife along in the past, so that now they had to divide the gold in half. In Hung said that all the credit for In Hung and her husband had to be divided in half. Then while Tin and her husband were not here, In Hung took off Tin and her husband's backpack and used her hand to grab a few handfuls of gold and put them in her backpack. Before Tang could react, In Hung had already grabbed a few handfuls and put them in her backpack. Unfortunately, Hoa was standing in front of the door at that time, witnessing the incident with her own eyes. Her eyes were extremely angry. She didn't understand why Hoa didn't follow Tin but ran back. 6 eyes looked at each other. Hoa was so surprised by Tang and his wife's actions that she didn't expect the older brother and sister that Hoa and her husband still respected to do such a shameful thing. Hoa didn't say anything and turned away, intending to run to Tin to tell Tin what had just happened. When Hoa had only run a few steps, she was pulled back by a stiff arm, covered her mouth with her hand and pulled into the house. "Miss Hoa, you, calm down and understand. It was a misunderstanding." Tang pulled Hoa back and tried to explain, but Hoa spoke loudly. "Taking my gold and putting it in your backpack, what kind of misunderstanding is that? How do you want me to understand you too?" Unexpectedly, as soon as Hoa finished speaking, a slap on her forehead slowly flowed out a stream of blood. Hoa was dizzy and lost consciousness and fainted. Tang then looked at In Hung in horror. You, why did you do that? If you hit her like that, what if she dies?" Now how am I going to explain this to Tin?" In Hung coldly said. "If you want to never be able to show your face to your parents again, if you want to have a bad reputation, even if you are rich in the future, you will still be known as a thief, then let her live. If she lives, she will tell her husband everything, ask you and me. Then how ashamed will your parents at home be? She cannot be allowed to live." Then In Hung glared, her eyes filled with bloodshot, and pulled Hoa toward the cliff. Tang didn't know what to do, his limbs were shaking. He panicked and followed In Hung's words like a mouse. Then he ran out and dragged Hoa to the ground with his wife. When they reached the cliff, Hoa suddenly woke up. She tried her best to get up and run away, but Hoa's arm just slipped out of Tang's hand, causing Hoa to drift closer to the cliff. Now if In Hung let go, Hoa would fall down. Hoa trembled, her mouth stammered, begging In Hung. In Hung's eyes were still cold and unchanged. Hoa looked out to beg Tang, but Tang could only stand there, trembling, his eyes turned away, not daring to look at Hoa's face. In Hung coldly let go of Hoa's desperate cry, echoing throughout the mountains and forests. Tang and his wife immediately turned away. From under the cliff, a sentence echoed that both Hoa and her husband could hear. "I will return for revenge. I will take revenge." Tang walked behind Hoa and stammered. So Uncle Tin, what should I say to?" Not letting Tang finish his sentence, In Hung immediately said, "If we're going to do it, we'll do it thoroughly. If both of them die, all the gold will be ours. To avoid future troubles, no one in the countryside will know that they're with us. If you and I don't tell anyone, how will anyone know?" Tang turned to look at In Hung. Tang could no longer recognize his everyday wife. Standing in front of Tang now, In Hung was no different from a cold-blooded professional killer. But Tang didn't understand why at that moment. He could only tremble and follow In Hung's words without making any move to stop her. Tam was digging some ginseng roots in the distance, suddenly feeling restless, hearing somewhere like his wife scream. He was about to leave when he saw Tang and his wife coming out. Tin immediately asked loudly, "Why are you two out here? I think I heard a scream. But where is your wife? Why isn't she coming out with me?" In Hung quickly replied, "She's at home looking after the things. How can I just leave all that gold and carry it around? It's not convenient to carry it with me." Tang and I suddenly remembered that right on the cliff ahead there are some medicinal plants that are very good for pregnant women. I thought I'd go out there and pick some so I can use them later. I probably don't have them in my hometown. Hearing In Hung say that, Tin looked happily at Tang and his wife. "So you two are pregnant, right? My wife Ho also bragged to me yesterday that she was probably about 2 months pregnant. It was really lucky that she found gold when she was pregnant. Okay, let me go with you to see what kind of tree it is. I'll pick some for Hoa." Tang was very startled when he heard that. He was about to say something, but suddenly he saw In Hung's eyes staring at him. His throat stiffened, and he couldn't say anything. When they reached the cliff, In Hung pointed out to Tin a type of tree growing close to the cliff. Tin had just walked out and was about to bend down to pick it when In Hung took the opportunity to push Tin straight down the cliff. A miserable scream rang out. Somewhere in the distance, a white figure was looking straight at Tang and In Hung. So both Tin and his wife passed away forever. They could no longer fulfill their cherished dreams. They died unjustly and tragically. Both fell from a high mountain and hit their heads on rocks. Even more heartbreaking was that they were two people who lived under the same roof, sharing cassava and sweet potatoes, sharing hunger and cold, bitterness and suffering together. Tang did not have such an evil intention, but when he saw In Hung doing that, he did not know how to fight back, letting things go too far. In the end, he helped his wife commit cruel acts that were worse than wolves. Tang and his wife returned to their hometown, under the guise of working far away at the border. After 10 years of being rich, they returned to their hometown, and of course no one knew that Tang and Tin were together. They were gone for about a week before returning home. When In Hung killed someone, she was cold, but on the way back, she kept looking back with worried eyes, feeling like someone was following her. After a few days of returning, strange things started to happen. Listening to Tang's parents, Tang and his wife understood that Hoa and her husband had come back to tell Mrs. Tam in a dream that they had died, and the red eyes on Mr. Tam's roof were also their ghosts. That's why In Hung learned through research that there was a witch in the district who specialized in exorcising ghosts, so In Hung told Tang to go find that witch. After asking for the witch's instructions, Tang buried the amulet in the alley, replaced the porcelain vase buried under the small temple. After that, Tang's family was at peace again, but the crimes did not stop there. At first, Tang and In Hung planned to buy a house in the district, but after hearing Mr. Tan, Tang and In Hung decided to stay and build a house on the family's land. Tang and his wife knew that Tin and Hoa had died, so no one would inherit that land. In Hung discussed with Tang a plan to take over Mr. Tam's land, because soon this place would be a prime location for business. Although they were very scared every time they went to Mr. Tam's house, to fool the public, Tang and Hung pretended to care for Mr. and Mrs. Tam like their biological parents and accepted Mr. Tam as their adoptive father in front of the villagers. This was all part of Hung's plan for Tang. When Hung was pregnant and everyone in the family urged Tang to build a new house for her and her children to avoid living in a dilapidated house, at that time Hung was the one who planned the plan for Tang. Almost Tang at that time was also greedy and followed Hung's crime. Realizing that Mrs. Tam's health was weak and could not bear the great shock, Hung and her husband went to inform Mr. Tam that Tin and his wife had died and gave Mr. Tam the bracelet that Hung had found in Tin and his wife's backpack, and indeed Mrs. Tam passed away a few days later. Mr. Tam also became sick and abandoned everything. After Mrs. Tam died, Tang and Hung saw many times white shadows in Mrs. Tam's garden flying and looking towards their house, afraid that something bad would happen. And seeing that scene every night, Hung lost her appetite and could not sleep, unable to bear it. Hung discussed with Tang to find a shaman and then put it on Mr. Tam's land. That morning Tang used the excuse of going to help Mr. Tam's family perform the 49-day ceremony for Mrs. Tam. When the rooster crowed, Tang got dressed and went over. Seeing Tang come over early, Mr. Tam said, "What are you doing here so early? It's not quite dawn yet. Sit there and play. I'll go down to the kitchen to make some tea." Waiting for Mr. Tam to leave, Tang quickly ran to the altar and took out the talisman that the shaman had given him and put it in the middle of the incense bowl. However, Mr. Tam saw all of Tang's actions. He had known about spells before, so he immediately realized what it meant. Tang turned around and saw Mr. Tam standing there with a wide face staring at him. He rushed straight to the incense bowl and pulled out the talisman. Tang was scared and didn't say anything. He was about to run away when Mr. Tam ran after him, grabbed Tang's hand and said, his mouth stuttering because he couldn't believe Tang would do this to his family. That talisman had the effect of preventing the souls of his son and his wife from entering the house. "Tang, Tang, why did you do that to your uncle and aunt?" Tang panicked and ran away. Mr. Tam tried to hold on to Tang's shirt. While struggling, Tang pushed Mr. Tam. Mr. Tam fell backwards, hit his head on the edge of the stone slab and died. Tang panicked and ran back to call out to all the villagers so that as many people could witness as possible, because looking at the scene, it was Mr. Tam's carelessness that caused him to fall. No one suspected Tang because Tang and Hung had a perfect cover for Mr. Tam's family. And then Tang and Hung did everything perfectly, achieving everything Tang wanted. Everything was always within Tang and Hung's calculations. The next morning, which meant Saturday morning after Tang and Hung's 2 children had an accident, people did not see Tang and his wife go out, but only to lay prostrate in front of the gate. When he saw someone passing by, he barked loudly as if he wanted to say something. He barked for a long time, then everyone was surprised and went into the house to see what was going on. When they reached the yard, everyone was terrified when Hung had hung herself in the middle of the house, her tongue hanging out, her eyes rolling back. It seemed that before she died, Hung was afraid of something terrible. Even though she died, the fear still remained in her eyes that were bulging out of their sockets. Everyone continued to call Tang, but no one answered. There was a locked room that seemed to be Tang's bedroom. They kept standing in front of the door barking. They had a bad feeling that the men broke into the room, and once again they were shocked and scared. On the bed a stream of dried blood flowed from Tang's mouth. In his hand he held a large bottle the size of a fingertip. Tang had taken poison and committed suicide. The villagers here witnessed a tragic event that perhaps 100 years later would never stop haunting the people here. The villagers told each other to hold a funeral for Tang and his wife as a way to help their family rest in peace. In their eyes, Tang and his wife were always good people who lived honestly in filial piety. They were sure that because Mr. Tam and Mr. Tan's families lived on that haunted land, then after a period of being suppressed, the ghost escaped to take revenge and kill everyone, leaving no one alive. Since then, people have fenced off the entrance to the house that contains such a painful and horrifying truth. Outside, the restaurant that used to be there was also abandoned, and no one dared to go there anymore. Sometime after Tang and his wife died, people still saw To lying in front of the house's porch, but after a long time, no one saw him anymore. The villagers still rumored that on bright moonlit nights, they saw many white shadows floating around the abandoned villa. On drizzly nights when the sky was pitch black, they heard screams and arguments. Sometimes they saw several white shadows playing with a black dog in the middle of the yard. Some old people also said that they saw a girl wearing a white dress with long hair reaching her heels. Her eyes were white and pupilless, standing in the middle of the yard of the house, and around her were 11 white shadows, big and small, including eyes that were red like 2 pieces of coal, extremely horrifying. The villagers told each other to pool money, to build a wall higher than a person's head around that land, because no one wanted to see those terrifying things every time they passed through that area at night. That land was abandoned, dark, cold, and had a creepy and mysterious story. The end.